All right, well, I think we'll get started. This is a great showing. Thanks for coming. Hopefully, the rain didn't disrupt your travel too much. So, Paul, I'll just call Paul out because he said, hey, when we were getting prepared earlier, he's like, this is kind of could be the theme for our program today. It's starting out stormy, and then it's going to, hopefully, the sun's going to come out. I think it already stopped raining. So, we're going to make it this scary subject of M&A due diligence. Hopefully, we'll shed some light on it, and it won't be so stormy and scary. So, again, my name is Mark Gardner. Thanks for coming, everyone. I know we had 100 people sign up for the virtual portion, so we have a bunch of people online as well. And hopefully they can see me if I'm standing in the right place here. Cameras are in the back. Have a couple housekeeping things to run through. And I think I have my slide. Here we go. This is maybe I'll run through this really quickly. This is the agenda for the day. So we'll talk about healthcare enforcement in a post-pandemic world. Jesse will lead that conversation. I will talk about this Goldilocks zone, and I'll kind of hold you all in suspense on that. Then we'll talk about beyond paperwork. Amanda will discuss. We'll really drill into the compliance topic. So again, today's program is really compliance, regulatory, and privacy focused. That's all we do at our law firm. So Amanda will drill into the compliance subject a bit further and how you can look at your target's compliance program, or if you are the target, what your compliance program should look like. She kind of builds on this Goldilocks idea, which I loved, Amanda. That was really good. Nate will then talk about claims after an acquisition. A lot of times you might buy a product and then realize that the people that decided to buy it didn't think about whether they could promote it for the use that it's been promoted for in the past. You know, you might have a different risk profile than the target did. So it's very important to focus on that. Paul will then talk about data breaches and privacy more generally. And then we'll have a panel discussion. We have Matt Doscotch from LivaNova, Sandra Cito from Abbott, and Gordon Weber as well here, so from Surmotics. So thanks for our panel for being here as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jesse, and we'll try and get to your questions. Actually, I have some housekeeping I do have to run through. We'll try and get through your questions today. If you have a question, raise your hand. We have like 30 minutes for each session, so it's intended to be kind of a rapid, I wouldn't say rapid fire, but we will do our best to get to your questions, and we have some time at the end of each presentation. We do have one break today as well, and then at the end we have a reception, and I did order some sunshine, so hopefully it'll be out by then. So if we don't get to your question during the day, we'll just take us aside, and we'll try and cover it on a break or during the reception. And then for online, remote participants, please submit your questions via the question function on the control panel. A couple other housekeeping. We are recording this. I think everybody knew that. And we'll break up the program in the 30-minute sections and email those out. We'll also, and they'll be on YouTube. So, if you want to share this with your colleagues, you're welcome to do that. All the slides are available. I'll just read these. Slides are available during the presentation virtually via the handouts. You have the handouts on your desk. And there's a window on the control panel where you can get them as well. 3.5 credits for the lawyers in the room. And then please request a CLE certificate to self-report in other states. There's also mugs out there. And we get a lot of compliments on the mugs. We're going into pontoon season here in Minnesota, so it's a nice a mug for those hot days. All right, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jesse.
Okay, so thanks everybody for coming. For those of you, most of you know me, but for those of you that don't, I'll give you the very brief version of my bio. So I'm a senior attorney with Gardner Law, specializing in FDA regulatory fraud and abuse, and legal and compliance considerations for pre- and post-market med tech and pharmaceutical products. For those of you that know me, you also know that I could spend the entire 3.5 hours talking, so I could regale you with stories. And so somebody wave your hand if I blow past 2 o'clock. So I'm going to jump in. We're going to talk about healthcare enforcement and kind of emerging from the pandemic and the kind of the unique circumstances that provides to us. So first of all, we'll do a brief kind of highlight of some enforcement action that is happening, and then we're going to talk about some of those pandemic considerations, what that provided to the med tech and pharmaceutical industry. And then we'll discuss how this kind of plays into due diligence activities. So I'm going to start with a poll. We good? Okay. I'm going to start with a poll. So and for those of you online, if you could go ahead and indicate any of these that apply, what disciplines or parts of the organization do you have responsibilities for in your organization? And while people online are selecting that, I'm going to just fire these off really quick, and if you could raise your hand. So first of all, legal. Okay, so a good chunk of the people here. Regulatory. Okay, likewise. Quality. Okay, couple. Clinical. Looks like one. And finance. One. All right, great. So, one of the things that I kind of want to dig into in this, and do we have?
Yes. So the online results are 66% legal, 48% regulatory, 24% quality, 7% clinical, and another 7% for finance.
Okay, got it. Excellent. So when we think about due diligence, and I'm mostly thinking about acquisition targets as I'm having this discussion. Although having a chat with one of you before this, it reminded me that even if you're entering into a partnership with the organization, you may be co-marketing, co-branding, you may be putting a product out alongside another organization. What we're going to talk about today are some of the considerations that go into that. I think we traditionally think of due diligence and the consulting firms that we hire for due diligence activities. We think of kind of financial fitness. We think of competitive assessments and market assessments. Targets, everybody's favorite word, synergies. I don't even know what that word means, to be perfectly honest, but it's a favorite of consultants. Operations, and then, legal, obviously, litigation, liability matters, IP. And then when it comes to regulatory, we think about approvals or clearances. We think about active or approved clinical trials. But so often, when I'm discussing acquisition target due diligence considerations with life science clients, there's this bucket of amorphous or kind of yet to be realized risk. And so that's where I start to think about some of the considerations, which are in the blue here, that are a little bit different from what your standard or your consultant organization due diligence activities might consider. As I was putting this together, I'm not a huge Liam Neeson fan, and I neither have a deep enough voice nor a Northern Irish accent that I can present this to you in. But when he says he has a particular set of skills in the movie Taken, I think about some of the regulatory and compliance due diligence considerations that it really takes kind of a broad approach or a broad breadth of knowledge in this area to understand how you might need to guide your business, how you might need to guide your finance leadership as to going into particularly an acquisition. So, like I said, under standard due diligence, you've got things like financial fitness, you've got competitive assessments, litigation, employment. But then when it gets to some of the regulatory and compliance due diligence considerations, it's important to think about some of the things that the documentation that a standard company would have in place that it may not reflect already. So things like inspections and audits that may not have happened or may not have happened recently. Clinical activity in quotes, which I will explain what I mean by that in a minute. Reimbursement practices, sales training as kind of a proxy for what the sales team is actually engaged in. And then claims, which I won't go over too much because I don't want to step on Nate's presentation in a little bit. So When I look at FDA enforcement and when I think about acquisitions, none of these are specifically in the context of an acquisition. None of these are saying FDA issued a warning letter, an untitled letter to somebody that had just recently been acquired or was in the process of being acquired. But when I think about enforcement updates and how it ties to today's topic of today's program, it's important to know what's going on so you can know what to look out for. So I'm going to hit on a couple of these, and then I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive on the next slide. So first of all, Procter & Gamble received a warning letter, I think 2 months ago. It was for NyQuil, which is something that, a product that I'm sure most of us have used. The particular issue was an incongruency between labeled active ingredients and the electronic listing file. And so, I highlight this one as a kind of a takeaway from this is confirm processes and procedures, and at minimum spot check regulatory filings against product documentation. So this is something that I think if you took at face value the labeling and you took at face value the electronic listing, you would assume that everything was on the up and up. Procter & Gamble's now dealing with a warning letter. They're having to remediate that. The next one, this is kind of a higher profile one that many of you might be aware of, but Makina, a drug approved under the accelerated approval pathway some years ago to reduce the risk of preterm birth in high-risk pregnancies. It ended up having what FDA considered to be an unacceptably unfavorable benefit risk assessment. And so the product was withdrawn. They're evaluating the extent to which it may still have an indication that that could save it and that it could re-enter the market. But I think here the takeaway is that you should familiar yourself with post-market evidence. The product was put on the market based on the pre-market evidence. Post-market evidence ended up putting it at risk. I would also highlight that these types of actions don't come as a surprise, typically. You don't typically get a letter saying you're required to withdraw from the market without having had some discussions with FDA. That was 2.5 years ago that these discussions were first publicly, that we were made aware of them. So make sure you do a quick Google search of the companies you're acquiring. Cornea Association of Texas. So I think a lot of you probably are not here representing a clinic for eye doctors, but there is something relevant from this warning letter that I'd like to highlight. And when I talked about, Medavance I'm skipping over because we're going to talk about that on the next slide. When I talked about clinical activities with air quotes, so this warning letter arose from a BIMO program inspection. There was a 69 subject in clinical trial all of them were enrolled and the clinical trial was underway. And this organization had failed to secure an IND exemption for an investigational new drug. And when I say clinical activity, this is obviously a pretty egregious example of where they're actually investigating a new drug. They've not gone through the regulations to ensure that they have an exemption in order to do that legally. And so it resulted in a warning letter. But I can't tell you how many times I hear about these little clinical, you've got the clinical team out there kind of just playing around, trying to kind of investigate, research a little bit. And oftentimes I hear about things like that, and they sound quite a bit to me like there's something that would require an IDE or an IND to perform. And so understanding this would never come up if you were evaluating their clinical trial or their approved clinical trial portfolio, because they don't have one. So you want to make sure that you're aware of some of the clinical, quote, activities that individuals or the companies are engaged in. In the quality and CAPA control space, I'll just highlight quickly, FDA has been a little more active with regards to having adequate, in fact, the highest percentage of enforcement actions have been in the space related either to not having adequate procedures, written procedures and policies, or not following them. I think something like 23% of untitled and warning letters in the last 2 years have been for that particular offense. And so all of these arose from that. You've got a GMP requirements for an OTC product and failure to comply with CAPA and investigation procedures for Zermatt. Champaclal, I don't pretend to be or even have ever traveled to India, but it's a company from India. It's an OTC drug manufacturer, and they ended up with toxic materials in imported product. I'll speak a little bit more about this in a second, but I'll just highlight that material assessments for products, particularly pharmaceuticals from outside the U.S., has been a particular focus from FDA recently. And then Sonovo, which I will talk about on the next slide briefly. So, brief deep dive on a few actions. And so Medavance is a company that holds a 510K for a dental device, the Velopex AquaCut Fluid Abrasion Unit. Easy for you to say. And it was discovered that since their clearance in 2003, they had made significant changes to the product. Those changes had not been addressed, had not been presented to the agency. Neither a new 510K or a special 510K had been submitted, and FDA determined that a new 510K was required for two reasons. One, the changes were of the type that was significant as to safety of the product. The changes arose from reliability concerns in the product. And two, that the changes were significant, so significant that the essential technology of the product was different. And so I highlight this warning letter to remind you that you need to not only rely on the fact or review the fact that you've got a 510K and that the product may resemble the 510K that was cleared, but you also need to look at what changes have been made to the product. And remember that when you're evaluating changes to a 510K product, you're not individually evaluating the last change that was made, but you're comprehensively evaluating all the changes that have made since the 510K was originally issued. Sonovo, somewhat similar, although it bridges the gap a little bit into the next topic. So Sonovo has a 510K for a hip system, a femoral resurfacing cap and total hip system. Critical to that 510K was that it was cleared for cemented use only. The company made significant changes, both labeling changes as well as some technology changes, to account for and allow for non-cemented use. FDA determined that not only did that make a significant change to the product, including its intended use, but it actually made it something that may have been subject to a PMA as opposed to a 510K. In addition to that, FDA then found that they had been engaged in unlawful promotion as a result of marketing it for non-cemented use. I will highlight that when FDA sends you a warning letter, they rarely just comment on the one thing. So both of these companies got slammed with a litany of other things, because if they're going to send one, they're going to get their money's worth. So there's a whole bunch of remediation that ends up on your hands when you have one of these issues. And so I think it probably goes without saying it's best to not get a warning letter. And if you do, there's a significant amount of work that goes into that. So, there's kind of two takeaways from these. I think one is the changes in design and assessing the product as it's marketed today versus what it was originally cleared for, particularly focusing on reliability issues, I would say. I think the Medavance situation highlights that. The other thing is that these types of issues can create considerable product liability concerns as well. It became very public knowledge that there were reliability issues with the Medavance product, and it became very public knowledge that Sonovo had been marketing the product for what is, and I'm no expert in hip replacements, but what is a significant difference in what they had originally presented safety and efficacy data for. And I anticipate that plaintiff's bar is very interested in that. Lastly, we'll highlight very briefly the Biogen case. This, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. It was 10 years in the making, a settlement that I believe was a $900 million settlement. And it arose from speakers programs that were essentially sham speakers programs. That OIG and DOJ highlighted a couple of things that were occurring. One was they were topics that were being presented in speakers programs basically were of no value to the company. Physicians that were prescribing Biogen MS drugs were being encouraged to speak on topics that the company didn't stand to benefit from in any way. Second, the sales force was really running the speaker program, which if your policy on speaker programs doesn't already prohibit that, I would encourage you to go update it when you leave here today. Basically, the sales force was allowed to use the offer of an individual, of a prescriber, participating in the speaker program as an incentive because they were being flown to fantastic places. They were all entertainment-style venues with very expensive alcohols, skiing, and other sorts of activities around exactly what you'd expect when you're going to go hear about an MS drug. So this was a significant settlement. A significant amount of money was paid. And I highlight it in part because speaker programs are one of the things that we work with clients the most on, that they come to us and they say, hey, we want to have physicians that are speaking on our behalf, but we don't have a policy on point. And this just highlights to me that you really should have a policy on point. And what you should be evaluating for a potential acquisition is whether or not they're engaged in these things in a compliant way. And I think that brings up the topic very briefly of successor liability, which I won't pretend to be an M&A expert. If you're acquiring a company, we're happy to support you in these activities. We also encourage you and are happy to refer you to an attorney that supports specifically M&A activities. But what I would say is this: depending on the transaction structure, you may end up with liability that you're acquiring along with the company. In certain structures, you may not, and that is really up to the M&A and to the structure of the transaction. But what I would say is, even if you don't inherit that liability from a financial or legal perspective, some of the pains in the butt that go along with these things, you almost certainly will inherit. So, for example, to the extent that there is a sales force that is coming over, there are policies that are continuing over, and you end up with a corporate integrity agreement, or you end up with significant remediation activities. Just know that even if you've structured your transaction to avoid successor liability, you may still have a whole lot of unenjoyable activities that come along with the acquisition. Really briefly, I'm going to highlight FTC enforcement. And so, as I think most of you know, there's a memorandum of understanding between FTC and FDA as to regulating promotion and advertising of medical products. Generally, primary responsibility for non-restricted medical devices goes to FTC, whereas prescription drugs and restricted devices lies with FDA. FTC, however, has recently reminded industry, and they're not shy about reminding everybody, that just because primary responsibility may be with one agency versus the other, that they have not ceded jurisdiction as to those claims. So you need to be aware of FTC as well and their regulations under the FTC Act. I think the primary issue that arose last month is that the topic of substantiation of claims. To ensure that your claims are substantiated, FTC uses a reasonable basis test, which I would speak to if I hadn't just gotten the 5-minute sign that I'm almost up. So I'm going to scoot past that, but I'm happy to speak with any of you later today about that. And I'm sure Nate will touch on it as well. So really quick, as we exit the pandemic, there are a few things that are unique in today's due diligence world that you need to be considering. So one is a whole slew of EUAs, emergency use authorizations, were granted during the pandemic. There is a transition plan for those, but there's a lot of work that goes into that. There's a lot of timing that you need to stay on top of, and you may not be able to market your product if you don't comply with the transition plan. The same goes for certain new products that hit the market during the pandemic. There were a variety of enforcement discretion policies that FDA put out as to somewhat lower risk, but still class 2 products that could be put on the market without pre-market notification. Evaluating the company's ability to meet the transition plan timelines in order to maintain the product on the market is critical. If it doesn't happen, you may be starting over from scratch. On inspections and audits, I'll just say FDA went from went from, it was something like 45% of, specific to foreign pharmaceutical manufacturers, because it's kind of a stark contrast, so it's a good number to use. 45% of firms had been inspected in 2019. In 2022, it was 6%. So there are a lot of, I'll just say, hidden landmines out there that not necessarily that FDA would have caught them all. And there are plenty of firms out there that are staying on top of things. But just know that there are landmines that you need to look out for. To the extent that that manufacturers have been performing audits themselves, mock audits, that certainly goes in the direction of better diligence on their part. And I'll just say FDA has started to kind of give a highlight as to how its enforcement is going to evolve in the coming years and coming out of the pandemic. They certainly will be using remote inspections more. I don't know if any of you have been involved in a remote inspection with a laptop that you can carry around and FDA can inspect on site. Yeah, that's great. So, and FDA has said they're going to keep doing that because it's saving them money, and Congress doesn't like giving them money. So, so that's something that I think will continue to be refined in the coming years. So, briefly, as kind of a key takeaways, a big part of this is just know where the company's at today, know where it's going, and know where you want it to go. That's particularly, I'm referencing claims when I think of that, and I'll really defer to Nate's discussion on that. But I'll just say, know what, make sure that you've engaged your marketing, make sure you've engaged your product, make sure you've engaged those individuals that think they know what they're going to be able to say about or how they're going to be able to sell your product. Engage them early on so that you can evaluate whether or not there's a legitimate basis for doing that. Make sure that you've invested in quality oversight prior to in the process of these activities. Like I said, EUAs, products subject to regulatory enforcement discretion, special lens on those, and the activities that are necessary to continue to market them after the PHE, and even potentially seeking outside independent regulatory opinion for some of these things, which is fairly common. As to compliance, the two things that I would really highlight are looking into sales training as evidence of sales practices, certainly to the extent you have a window into in-fact sales practices. That's really important too, but just remember that sales training is something that FDA as well as OIG look at as kind of evidence of what the firm intends its sales force to do. And then make sure that you understand that inherited liability is not just on the transaction itself, but the remediation work and the other expensive stuff that can come with inheriting a mess. So that's it. I think we have time for a couple of questions if anybody has any. No? Perfect. All right, I will hand it off to Mark.
I think my mother every year got a report that I was really hyper in class, so me standing behind this is not going to work, so let's move that out of the way. And most of you probably already know that about me. So my background, I've been in the industry for, if you don't know this, I won't bore you too much, but since 1999. So it's getting less cool every year to say how long I've been in the industry. It's been now 24 years. Maybe I'll just switch to 20 plus years. But I've always worked in healthcare. I started at a lab, then went to a startup, and then went to EV3 Covidian, where I met Dawn here and a bunch of other people I stay in touch with still today. I then started practicing law. That was 14 years ago. I worked at a boutique firm for 7 years and then started Gardner Law 7 years ago. And as you probably know, I think I mentioned earlier, we focus on regulatory compliance and privacy, and that's it. I also teach at Mitchell Hamlin, start teaching at the University of Minnesota Law School and Carlson now. So the last thing I'd say is for the attorneys here, and actually our section for the MSBA, Food, Drug, and Device Law section, we also, it's not just attorneys, we have regulatory quality professionals. Just a quick plug for them. It's a great local group that talks about a lot of the things we're talking about here today. So I'd encourage you to sign up if you're not already a member. So I'm going to cover this Goldilocks zone concept. And I'll talk about top due diligence questions. We'll talk about where folks are likely to focus if you are the target of an acquisition, if your company's being bought, or if you're buying a company. I'll give you some tips on what I think you should focus on. And I'll also talk about the fun data room. Everybody is familiar with the data room. Some case studies and how to prepare. And I have some time for Q&A as well. I think we're actually ahead of schedule for the first time in the history of our programs. So I won't use up all that time because I'm sure we'll spend it elsewhere, but we will have time for some questions. So, audience question. Are you or have you been involved in acquisitions? Raise your hand if you've never been involved in one. Okay, got a couple folks. And everyone else, yes, has been involved. Okay, how many were the buyer? Seller? Both? Okay, I probably should have put both on there as well. Yeah, it's pretty common in our industry, right? In medtech, pharma, it's seems to be a pretty popular model. We've got our big strategic companies out there and we have a really robust entrepreneurial, group in this country that's constantly developing new drugs and medical devices. So the big fish eat the little fish, right? And that seems to help humanity because the big fish are particularly good, one would think, at getting those innovations out to the physicians. Not always. Rebecca, question. Oh, thank you. Online results. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so 29% said no, 38% said yes as a buyer, and 33% said yes as a seller.
Okay, great. So more folks that haven't been involved in a transaction that are online. So good. Well, we can give them pull back the curtain here and give them some tips because I'm sure they probably will eventually be part of one. Okay, so the Goldilocks zone. Did anyone know what that was before today? All right. Okay, one. Yeah, I had initially called this, or I was thinking it was going to be like the good, bad, and the ugly, M&A due diligence. And then for whatever reason, because I'm a nerd, we were in Mexico and I went online. I was working on this there. And I discovered that like 4 or 5 other law firms had that same title for this activity, and so I had to come up with something new. So I meditated a bit, took a nap, and then this is what I came up with. So the Goldilocks zone, I'm just going to read this. This is from NASA. It's a habitable zone around a star where liquid water can exist on the surface of surrounding planets. Like the third of the 3 bowls of porridge in the tale of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, this is the sweet spot where it is neither too hot nor too cold, but just right for life to exist, right? So if you're going to buy a company, you want to be in the Goldilocks zone. You want that target to be in the Goldilocks zone. I suppose if you are being bought, you want your strategic to be in this zone as well, unless you're going to leave the company shortly thereafter. So applying that, that concept to buyers, and again, Amanda's going to expand on this after me, but we kind of thought about this. I think I actually called Amanda from Mexico, so she's also a nerd with me. But we said, a company that's too cold. So if you're a strategic looking at a startup, if they lack necessary regulatory compliance and privacy controls. So again, this would be like if the QMS is a mess. No, not trying to make a joke there, but their compliance program is just off or non-existent. If the privacy controls, they're like GDPR, what's that? And they're heavily involved with Europe. This company is too cold. They're not really sophisticated, or perhaps they're naive when it comes to their approach. Because these things are so important today now that companies will say, hey, I'm not buying this company because their entire setup is they're bribing doctors, right? Like if you think, hey, there's this great business and you peel back some layers and you find out that half of the customers of the company are consultants, that's a huge red flag. And you should walk away from that deal. I'm not sure about privacy necessarily. That maybe is remediable, which Paul will hit on. Paul will probably disagree with me and say, no, that could also be really bad because there's companies in Europe getting fined hundreds of millions of dollars, right, Paul? So these are things you got to consider before you make the buy. Same with regulatory, if the QMS is just, it's a problematic situation. Let's say if there's tens of thousands of complaints coming in and there's no MDRs as a result, there's, what's happening there, or that those complaints aren't being used to improve the product, for example. So that would be too cold. Too hot would be, they have a great compliance program and other programs, but they just don't comply with them. So the person that's leading compliance is just people aren't following that person's rules and direction. And maybe it's even a top-down approach. Hey, we're compliance, yeah, we got that, but we're just not going to worry about that because they get in the way of sales. That would be one that would be too hot, in my opinion. Or you uncover that conduct that's just clearly illegal. Again, most of the customers say they're consultants. The AVIMED and Pharma Code are just not adopted. Hey, I remember that gift ban thing that came out in 2009 or whatever. We're not doing that. Or we are, we're not following that. We're continuing to provide gifts. You start to see some of those red flags that should make you pause and say, gee, this company's too hot. Or they're just not meeting safe harbors. Like the AKS, anti-kickback statute, has safe harbors for things like hiring doctors, for providing rebates and discounts, for warranting product, for having physician investment in your company. So that's my play on that Goldilocks concept. This is really, again, where we're going to focus. We already talked about that. These are all the enforcement branches over here on the right, which you're all familiar with. And this is really the meat of my presentation here now. So if you are in charge of compliance or regulatory or privacy at your company, or all of the above, let's say, I know we have a couple CEOs sign up as well, you should be expected to get all of these questions and all of these. And I could probably, if you talk to me, I can get you, 4 times as many of the questions as this, where I've had clients get just, maybe 80 questions, right? But these 20 are really going to be what I pulled from being involved in M&A transactions for, the last, for my entire career. Really focusing, though, in the last 14 years on this subject. These are the top questions that I see in each deal. So you could use these if you were approaching a strategic. You should also be prepared to answer all of these if you're the target of a transaction. So a lot of these questions are open-ended. I will say this before getting into this. I've been involved in diligence where it's, believe it or not, it might be like a 30-minute conference call with an underwriter or a strategic or whomever. Maybe they went through the data room and were really happy, but that to me is really light diligence. I've been involved in transactions where the quality function alone is audited and reviewed and analyzed and picked apart for a month. So it really depends on the strategic. And I don't have an answer for how many hours you should spend on each topic, but I'd say at least a couple days of diligence is necessary. So questions you're likely to get: describe your compliance program. So, what are the policies and procedures that you have? I'll just keep kind of rolling through here. Have there been violations of your compliance policies? There probably should be in most situations. I know Amanda was the compliance officer at Coloplast. There's 1,200 people in the field in North America. You're going to have compliance violations. People are going to go over their meal limits. Maybe a safe harbor isn't going to be followed. You're going to have potential contracts that are out of, maybe they've expired. There's going to be situations where people are going to make mistakes. So if I get a response, because we do these audits for our clients a lot of times they're like, hey, we're looking to have an exit in a year. We want you to come in now and look at us. I'll ask if there have been any violations. And if the compliance officer says no, I'm kind of like, How is that? There should be some violations, arguably. And then it's about how those were remediated, which is what I want to see. How do you vet consultants and employees for exclusion, debarment? So there's free resources online. Every time a consultant is hired, they should be checked against the OIG exclusion list. There should be a SAM check on them. The FDA debarment list should be reviewed. There's also a list for the international, which has a great name. And Amanda, do you remember the international? It'll come back to us. Sorry to put you on the spot. But there's an international one where, if you're on the international bad guy list as well, you want to look at that. So the people should be, you should be checking them. So if folks are not doing any sort of checks, that's a red flag. Do you perform auditing and monitoring? And if you say yes, I would immediately ask, can I see the reports? And you want to be careful producing those reports. Hopefully they're under attorney-client privilege, ACP. So you're going to not want to share those. Do you have a compliance hotline? These are that. A lot of companies don't have compliance hotlines, which kind of surprises me. This is something the OIG would ask you as well if you're the target of an investigation. It costs for less than $100 a month easily, and it's more like probably $25, $35. You can have a compliance hotline, where there's somebody, a third party that will just accept complaints on your behalf and then tell you. Do you have a compliance officer? I get that. So when we do these audits, a lot of times it's yeah, we don't have a compliance officer yet. And a lot of times they're commercial companies outselling with 30 reps in the field. You got to have a compliance officer. That's a red flag if you don't. You need to have a compliance committee that meets regularly. And for a startup, that might mean periodic. That might be, once a quarter. It doesn't need to be every week. What's the ratio of HCPs to consultants to customers? So there was the Lifespine case. Sorry to pick on Lifespine. But they had, I want to say the number was half of their customers were consultants, right? And we don't know all the facts around that. Maybe they had a lot of contracts that were open that were just not being utilized. But obviously, if you're the target of a government investigation, they're not going to do you any favors. They're going to say, well, looks like this contract's still open, even though the physician didn't consult for the last 5 years, it's still an open contract. So I don't know how they did the math on that, but you can read the DOJ website if you want more information or the complaints. But we did work with some clients on that where they wanted us to audit their HCP engagement. And we did find a lot of consultants that were maybe used one time for something. And we said, term those agreements. We want to get this down to a single digit number, and it shouldn't be a high single digit number of, and ultimately the safe harbor, you want bona fide services. That's really fundamental reason you should hire a doctor. It should never be to curry favor with them. But you certainly do not want to have this ratio be high where you have a lot of consultants. Have you had any recalls, warning letters, MDRs, or other issues? That's becoming a very interesting subject for prosecutors. If you have a faulty medical device or pharmaceutical, and you know that, and then you're shipping it out and selling it to people, the government's going to say you are defrauding us every time you sell one of these products and we pay for it. So under the implied certification theory to the False Claims Act, when the healthcare provider is asking the government to pay for something, they sign off and say everything's on the up and up. If a manufacturer induces that purchase by lying or providing a product that is broken or mislabeled or whatever it may be, or manufactured improperly, that inducement, they've induced this purchase, which the government then paid for, or they just made the device wrong, for example. Maybe they didn't tell the purchaser that it was made wrong, but that failure to do something is also, it causes them to be liable, right? So that's a very popular theory right now, is adulterated products and the government saying you're defrauding us. And like the wins, the prosecutorial decisions change, So years ago it was off-label. That was the big topic, right? And it's not anymore because there's so many cases that the government lost. So that's not as an attractive theory to go after, but products made wrong, that's very exciting right now. And then inducement, bribery. Those are the two dominating prosecutorial trends right now. So, and by the way, we all know what whistleblowers are. So you've got potentially the enemy within, right? I'm not trying to color all whistleblowers because they ultimately, if they're being forced to do something they don't believe is right, we want them to raise their hand, right? That's very important. But there's also a financial incentive for a whistleblower that can get up to 15% of a recovery, which if the recovery is $1 billion, that's a big paycheck. So, you got to think like people's decisions may be impacted by that. Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you repeat that?
Sure.
And I'm going to ask my team to listen to this because I do not know.
Sure. In the last
this.
24 to 48 hours, there was a settlement related to physician inducement for a local company, name I've forgotten, but it was a physician inducement for implantation or diagnosis. So I was just curious if you had a take on that particular storyline.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else does in the room for our team or not. That is,
I could Google it. I mean, yeah, it was Bloomington, I'm pretty sure.
No. No, I mean, I haven't looked at it a lot 'cause in the past, but I looked at it briefly and it was pretty egregious, right? The amount and the physicians and the kind of the scheme of referrals back and forth. So, sometimes you'll see something like that. And I don't expect most clients to have that kind of program in place. But, I think a takeaway from that is, right, when you see something, say something at the outset because things balloon and grow. And when you're going to get those huge judgments is when it's ballooned to that point where those facts look like that in a fact pattern, right? And that's pretty hard to walk back from in front of the government and say, oh, sorry, this was just a breakdown in compliance, we'll fix it, right? I mean, that's a snowballing effect. So, like I said, I haven't read every part of it, but I read enough to know that, those facts are what you'd see typically, but that's why it led to such a big judgment. So.
Thank you, Nate. Glad you're paying attention. So I'll just come back to this. We're talking about whistleblowers. I serve as compliance officer under secondment for clients. So does Amanda. And we want whistleblowers we want people that see things wrong to tell us. Let's make that all clear. Point being that any one of your employees in any one of your organizations can become a whistleblower. So if they see something wrong in one of these areas, they may become a plaintiff against your company, right? So that's driving a lot of interest in what we do for a living, obviously, because the stakes are very high for the manufacturers and the officers that run those companies. And I should say that responsible corporate officer doctrine, we've seen it go down to director levels within companies. So it's not, you don't have to meet the officer definition under the law. You might be a director, for example, of reg and still be held accountable under that park doctrine, or a CFO. Sorry, John. You're going to be asked to describe your privacy program policies and procedures. That's a really up and coming, has been for years. Eventually we'll have a federal privacy law because otherwise we're going to have 50 state plus DC privacy laws. So hopefully that will be coming, and maybe Paul can give us more direction on that. But you should be prepared to talk about what you're doing, your privacy policy, your terms of use on your website. Those seem like things like we're like, yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter what it says. We just copied some other companies. You need to know actually what those say because you're going to be asked about them in diligence, and you should ask the target about them and ultimately make sure that they're appropriate. With GDPR, for example, there's real penalties. Here in the U.S., I'll defer to Paul on that, but I think a lot of the heat is on the GDPR. So it's people information coming from Europe to the U.S. especially. That's a big risk area that I think companies are paying attention to. Okay, so we're halfway through these top 20 questions. What's your process for meeting the sunshine requirements? And now we're not just talking about Massachusetts. We've got a multitude of states, depending on whether you're a drug or device maker. If you're a drug, you have more states to worry about. But we have it even down to the city or county level now. So you want to make sure you're paying attention to those rules. I guess from my perspective, if I'm involved and my client says, I haven't filled out any of these things, I just learned about them today, and we've been operating in Massachusetts for the past 8 years, what should I do? My answer is write a big check. So it's going to be $2,000 a year times 8. Send it to Massachusetts, and that's probably going to be the last you're going to hear about it. But you do need to be in compliance with these rules. At any moment, a state AG could change their mind and come after a company. Vermont was active for a bit with their rules. If anybody's dealt with Nevada, we know Leo at Nevada quite well now because he's very active with making sure companies are licensed and registered appropriately. And so I think that's my next one on here. Believe it or not, if you're a medical device or drug company, you need to have a license to distribute your product in most states. A lot of companies don't know about that. We've been really busy with those requirements lately. And there's been some action on the state level with those. How do you handle complaints? That used to be not so much an interesting area for strategics. It's much more interesting now. They're going to ask you about that. And if you have a huge numerator and a small denominator from complaints to MDRs, be prepared to defend that. Like why you took in 10,000, 20,000 complaints and you have one MDR. Is that right? Have you been subjected to government investigation, warning letters, entitled letters, civil investigative demands, other inquiries? I left this question off here, but on one of the lists I was reviewing, because we have a lot of these at our firm, it was, what about your customers? Do they, if they've been, to me, it's sort of like, well, that's the customer, it's not us, but you might be asked that. These all apply to OUS. Generally speaking, philosophically, you're going to be asked about these things with your international transactions. I have with some of our larger clients, they will also they'll do like a distributor audit, for example, because that's usually where all the action is the distributors that are OUS. And I've had questions like, well, how can we audit them ahead of time? And you can, and you should, if you have the resources and time. But my general response or thought is, make sure you're hiring a reputable distributor that's well known. They're probably going to be more expensive, but hopefully they'll be more sophisticated, but not always, right? Like, just because a company is big doesn't mean it's going to be always doing the right thing. Do you perform an annual needs assessment for your consultants? That's an important one, because if you are in a commercial role, sales are down, and you're thinking, well, I'm just going to go and engage a bunch of KOLs so that they start using more of my products. You're not going to be able to do that if on January 1st, you agreed to what you already needed. Of course, there's exceptions to this rule where maybe some new need comes up and you go through that, but you should have a robust process for identifying the consultants you need ahead of time. So again, what does that accomplish? It's curbing your commercial team from trying to prime the pump with consulting arrangements or grants or whatever it may be. What are the company's sales and marketing practices as they relate to discounts and rebates? There's very specific safe harbors on point from the OIG. What sort of reimbursement support do you provide? That's becoming a more interesting topic that's looked at a lot more, especially in the pharma side. So it's coming to device. A lot of times OIG starts with pharma and comes to device later. So quick plug for, I'm co-chairing a conference in DC, the FDLI Ad Promo Conference in October, and Mary Reardon comes pretty much every year to that conference. And she's the OIG official that's very influential on policy making when it comes to where they're going to focus their invest their resources. So that's a great conference to go to where you can literally go up to Mary and talk to her. And I've asked her that question. Do you predict any special, any changes to the OIG's take on reimbursement support? And her response is back a couple of years. Now that we're back in person with all this stuff, I'm looking forward to asking this question again this year. But, she's essentially said as long as it's not tantamount to an inducement, you're going to be okay. So your reimbursement support programs should really be focused on supporting the patient, helping them get access to therapy. And it's much more complex than that, but be prepared to defend your support practices from a compliance, regulatory, and privacy perspective. Don't sign BAAs unless you're a BA. If you don't know what those words mean, see me on break. And then describe the company training practices for employees and consultants. And I thought what Jesse said about training is particularly important because a lot of times in audits we'll ask, and you should expect to even be asked for those in diligence, your training materials. And for some reason, there's this misconception that the government won't look at training materials or they don't need to go through our copy review process. They absolutely do. They're arguably more important than any other piece. It's how you're training your salespeople and what you're telling them to do. So the government's immediately going to go to those. So those need to be reviewed and approved. Where will the focus be? I won't read this slide. It's going to be on how you're paying doctors. And it's going to be now more on how you're manufacturing your product and specific to complaints. And privacy also is, I see that those needs ramping up. Be prepared to defend your open payments. Everything's reported, right? Presuming the company has reported. And I should say, if you're the target of the purchase, be prepared to defend them. If you're purchasing an organization, it's a great place to go and read about how they're spending their money on consultants. The data room, I'd say the headline for this is do not put ACP materials in your data room. Seems kind of obvious, but don't do that. I would throw all this stuff in there. Like anytime you paid a doctor, that should be in there. And so if your board is saying, hey, and I know I'm flipping back and forth a bit here between seller and buyer, but if you're the seller, if you're the compliance officer at a seller and your company, the board is saying we're going to sell this company within a year, make sure that all these agreements are executed and up to date. If you're paying Dr. So-and-so and he's your favorite KOL, he better have an up-to-date consulting agreement that you're going to put in the data room. A lot of times we come in and do audits and it's like half the contracts are expired or, oh, the CEO signed that guy up, so we never memorialize that arrangement. Like that's not going to fly with the buyer, So, and then all your grant agreements, you should have a process for providing grants. You should have a grant committee that meets and makes decisions based upon the nature of the research and the value, not, someone being a big customer, obviously. I'm seeing this gets kind of hairy with the FDA quality related materials. Your quality function is going to decide. But there's so much in the QMS, right, that I don't know if that's going to be feasible to put that in the data room. But obviously the strategic's going to want to dig into that. So they're going to need to gain access to that. Reps and warranties. You'll be, when you're getting close to the deal being done, you're going to have your buyer-seller agreement, and you're going to have sections in there on reps and warranties that relate to all these laws that we cover, or all of these laws and more. Right? So you're going to want to make sure if you're a buyer that you're not using an old form that doesn't talk about GDPR. And if you are a seller and you're not operating in Europe, you don't want GDPR in the agreement. If it's in there, strike it. Say, we don't operate in Europe, so we're not going to make a representation about GDPR. We don't have any data coming from. So the idea here is with these reps and warranties is making sure that it applies to you. So again, if you're the buyer, that you have up-to-date warranties and reps. And like Paul tells me, not infrequently, okay, we've got a new privacy law in such and such state. You're going to want to add that in here. Hey, you guys are following this law, right? Because like Jesse said earlier, some of this liability carries through, maybe it doesn't. This agreement will be important at that time. And maybe if you're not sure they're going to follow the laws, then you have some sort of carve out, and maybe you take money and hold it in escrow, and that money comes out later if there's no claims, for example. Sellers, I mean, it goes without saying, but make sure you're being truthful about your representations and warranties. There's times where it's not uncommon for a seller to say, well, we did have that warning letter. Do we need to talk about that? Yeah. You don't want to be hiding things, right? But, if it's a 483, I don't know, you're going to need to massage that language. 43s are pretty common, right? If you've got especially as your company gets bigger, the higher the likelihood that FDA is going to discover something wrong on a routine investigation. This virtual investigation thing, I'm not a fan of that. I don't think I appreciated how much that's apparently happening. I think for my tax dollars, I'd like to see the government on site, but that's a different CLE, I think. This is my wrapping up slide here pretty quick. So I'm actually reading to my daughter here. She's going to prom on Saturday, so she's growing up now. But I'm reading the Big Bad Wolf to her there. So that Big Bad Wolf is the regulator, I think. So these are some case studies just from my years of doing this. I'll kind of hop around on this list. One that I often talk about, I'm going to start down here. Once had a client where one person in a company decided it was a good idea to pay for a mailer. So they wanted to share information about their product. So they worked with a physician, and then the physician took their database of patient information out, and then the company, through this product manager or whatever they were, paid for the postage, right? You can't do that. You're not supposed to do that. So if you have any marketers asking you to do co-markets with customers and it involves PHI, you can't pay for any access to that PHI, not even mailing, blah, blah, blah. Be really careful with that. Those rules are buried in a final rule, a preamble to, I think, Paul's like a 2012 omnibus rule for some changes to HIPAA. But this turned out to be the reason a strategic did not buy a company that I worked with. So that little thing, which in my own mind, I was like, I don't think that's your reason. I think it's something else. But you can be subject to really strict review. So, be careful. Obviously be careful, but just be mindful that these privacy issues do show their faces, and you might have some really weird thing come up that you're not even aware of. Too much access to PHI. Seen situations uncovered in diligence where it turns out the target company, actually one was going public, for example, and some of their folks were actually getting too much into the patient information, which arguably took them beyond a mere supporter from a reimbursement function and got them into a situation where they were more like a business associate or even a covered entity. I've seen situations where the compliance program is kind of nascent, non-existent, pull that 3-ring binder off the shelf and blow the dust off. I've also seen really effective compliance programs, and companies get gold stars from strategics looking at them. I already talked about how I've been on conference calls for 30 minutes, and they're like, okay, that's our diligence for this acquisition. It's like, wow. Are you investors in Elizabeth Holmes Company, maybe? That you really do want to dig in, get under the fingernails. What else is interesting on here? There was a company that we worked with that attorneys in DC dreamt up some quality issue that didn't exist, and that was the reason why they said they didn't buy the company. only to have another strategic come in, look at quality very closely. Yeah, it was like a month, and they ended up buying the company. So you see it all kinds. Often see off-label promotion and use. I think, in my mind, having done this for a long time now, people are very afraid of off-label promotion. I think it's a big deal. I'm not here to say you shouldn't worry about it, but and they're actually, let me explain that a bit, unpack that further. They're afraid of off-label use, really. You should be afraid of off-label promotion. Your company should not do it. But physicians will use products off-label. So I remember when I worked at EV3, we had a biliary stent franchise that was used, those products were used off-label nearly all the time. And company went on to get them approved for on-label uses after the FDA met with a bunch of companies that were in that biliary stent business. But I would, if you are looking at a target and you're strategic, just because the product is used off-label doesn't mean you should walk away from that deal necessarily. Maybe you look at it from a different angle. What will it take for us to get that use on label? Maybe that company doesn't have the resources to do that because it's PMA and you do. So there could actually be a diamond in the rough there, for example. And how do you find out if a company is promoting their product off-label? Look at their websites, hire an expert. You have your own internal experts. Look at their promotional materials. Maybe you could even do a ride-along to see how they pitch the product. I think that's probably a controversial concept, but if I were a buyer, I would, why not? Hey, can we go ride along with one of your reps, see how they sell the product, see how they interact with physicians? Going back to Theranos, I don't know how that happened because that to me is a diligence failure, and I have 5 minutes. Thank you. Getting the hook. But that is one of those deals where I read that book, and we've done CLEs on that topic. I did one at Mitchell Hamlin, which was a lot of fun, and watched the Netflix and all that, and it's just like, wow. I mean, that is like the antithesis of adequate diligence. How that was not discovered immediately is just mind-bending to me, especially having worked at a lab, because I actually remember having lunch with a friend, Amy Fowler, down in Nicollet Mall, and we met with a couple folks that were kind of a me too to Theranos. And me having a laboratory background, I was kind of excited to meet with them. And I'm like, how are you going to get this machine that's the size of a Volkswagen into this like little box? And it's like, oh, we're going to figure it out. And it's like, you're not actually. You can't do that. So just kind of in closing here, how should you prepare if you're the buyer? List out your questions ahead of time and don't wing it. I gave you 20 questions that you can start with. Take time to perform your diligence activities. Get experts involved. I mean, that's one thing I see a lot if I'm representing the seller. And by the way, bring your outside counsel in on those calls if you like. It's all lawyers on the calls anyways. They're not going to be afraid because they might be able to help support you. But sometimes the experts the people asking diligence questions are asking really kind of 101 questions, where I'm kind of wondering, are they going to ask about this? And they don't. And they're asking about just more basic things. So you're going to get your experts involved. Review the materials. Don't forget about promotional materials. Nate's going to really focus on that. That's critical. And I don't want to steal Nate's thunder, but he's seen things where he's like, company X buys company Y, and then company X afterwards is like, oh, we can't promote it for that? What? It's like, how did you not discover that in diligence? That's crazy. You just spent huge money for this company. Interview people live. Don't just live in the data room. I think you can learn way more about people live, and a lot of times people want to share information with you. Don't get deal fever. Be willing to walk away if the juice isn't worth the squeeze. That's where I know a colleague had said, and she works in-house, but she was on a couple deals, and after her diligence, she had to go to, essentially up to the CEO, big company, and say, no, this is bad. You don't want to buy this company. So I'm sure the BD guys on that are like, are you kidding me? I've been watching this company for, years. They're great. And then that's where, again, to Jesse's point, we're not M&A lawyers, but maybe you can get creative and say, we see this red flag. We're going to park X dollars in escrow. If there's no claims in 5 years, you get the money. If there are, then we're going to use that money. We get it, or we use it to defend the claim. Follow your intuition. If something feels off, dig deeper. Consider asking if you can do ride-alongs. I already talked about that. Seller, this is obvious, but if you're going to sell your company in a year, go through Mark's 20 questions and make sure you're all polished up on those. That's the time to start remediation activities. Nobody expects you to be perfect. If you've got your QMS is messed up, for example, start fixing it. It's about the remediation. Know your risk areas. If you're in orthopedics, for example, sorry to pick on orthopedics, that's a space that the government, in their mind, they think it's susceptible to bribery. So you're going to want to know that, because the person that's buying you is going to be knowing that. So they're going to be particularly keen on your compliance program if you're in certain segments. All your contracts should be current, executed, meet the safe harbor. I'm talking about the personal services and management contract, safe harbor to the anti-kickback statute. If you don't know the answer, don't guess, obviously, right? Review your reps and warranties carefully. Don't disclose ACP materials. Know your system. To err is human. It's human. It's about remediation. Show that your systems work. I know when Amanda and I audit, and others in our firm, we're kind of like, oh, good. There's something that was broken and they fixed it. That's like a positive to a compliance auditor. And be ready to be interrogated over quality matters. That's my time. Any questions? Yes. Thank you. Rebecca, got a question from the audience. Do we have any questions online? Okay. People online, please feel free to ask questions.
So Mark, you referenced reimbursement market access as another category. Many companies, and I'll use InspireMed as one example, are very involved with the direct to patient. And so in the context of your comments, any hot topics, any voice of reason to layer on top of that effort from companies as they counsel patients directly or help educate patients directly?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think, there's been this, you've probably been at some companies where, you've got a reimbursement support function, and I've seen them they're outsourced, say, to Priya or Argena or whomever, JDL Access, and then they're brought back in-house. And I've seen them kind of go like in and out sometimes. I feel like lately I've seen more going in-house. So people like the control. Challenge with in-house is that you then build it, you're kind of stuck with it if it doesn't work. It's easier to fire a consultant than a team that you just established in-house. But what I would do in those situations, I would audit them annually, at least I would think, maybe biannually, once every 2 years or once a year, I would say. But, policies and procedures are really critical. So we're actually working with a client right now on just establishing a program that they're bringing in-house. And so we're very keen on the three areas we talked about today. Making sure the privacy piece is kind of obvious because you're working with a patient, so you're going to need a patient authorization, a robust process that the patient says, I'm letting you have access to my data. Or you could become a business associate, which is another option. And a lot of clients are taking that route, especially if they're related to AI, they have AI applications or other applications that require a lot of access to patient information. So I'd look at the privacy. You also want to make sure the cases you're supporting are on label. So a knockout needs to be, we're not going to support any off-label cases. So there's FDA ramifications, regulatory ramifications. then from the compliance perspective, that's where it's deep, right? Like, so a lot of these programs, they say, what can we do for a rebate if the payer ultimately denies coverage and we've already implanted or treated the patient? You know, so we've actually recently done some work with copays as well. What are the options for waiving those? There was an advisory opinion that came out that was friendly to industry. We actually, Jesse just also submitted an OIG advisory opinion on a similar question, and we're drafting another one for a different client on a reimbursement related question. So it's those support programs touch all of the compliance hot buttons, if you will, the regulatory privacy compliance. And I think just staying on top of them, I think it can be a really great model, especially if it's in-house and you're controlling the process. But you want to kind of keep on top of them, because it can be an area where you can really go off the rails. If there's, especially if there's some sort of reimbursement guarantee associated, you want to be careful with those. Jesse, question?
I was just going to add to that. Really, so OIG has, especially in some recent advisory opinions, has been, like Mark kind of alluded to, has been a lot more permissive in allowing kind of broader support than I think most of us would have assumed they would allow even a few years ago. And so, but it really comes down to, and OIG is relying on things like the, under the beneficiary inducement CMP, they're relying on patient access to care, right? And so, but having legitimate purposes for patient access to care is the key there. And you see people trying to couch things as patient access to care that they really aren't. So that's the other part of it, is evaluating those programs to ensure the legitimacy to meet one of the exceptions to, for example, the CMP.
Thank you. And I want to have Amanda come up. Maybe as you're walking up, any other questions? I think I'm at my time, but I wanted to just add one more comment on this topic of reimbursement. I know Amanda sat on the committee that reviewed the AVIMED guidance for reimbursement support, and among the committee there was not, I want this. Ultimately the committee decided not to change anything. If you remember when the AVIMED code was updated, I think it was went into effect January 2020, so around there. Yep. June, nothing was changed in that section, but there was disagreement among, like, there wasn't 100% alignment on the committee with reimbursement support. So for me, that is a hot area to keep track of if you're providing reimbursement support, because at any moment you could have a whistleblower, you know, that could become an interesting de jure kind of prosecutorial subject of interest. So you just want to be careful with that. So I'm at time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mark. So that was actually a nice kind of introduction into the rest of the afternoon. I'm going to be deep diving a little bit more into compliance program aspects. But first I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Amanda Johnston. I'm a managing attorney at Gardner Law, and I've been with the firm for 4 years, almost exactly, actually. So prior to joining the firm, I worked in-house at various companies in compliance and regulatory. And at the firm, I split my practice between healthcare compliance, so helping put compliance programs together, providing guidance on commercial programs. And then I also have regulatory, so FDA strategy, submission work, working with FDA, all that fun stuff. I also teach drug and device law at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law with Mark and Bryn. But yeah, all right. With that, we will dive in. So today I'll do a brief refresher on elements of an effective compliance program. We'll talk a little more in detail on why compliance is important in M&A and some special considerations for diligence in particular. And Mark had 20 questions. I have boiled it down to 4 that I think are key inquiries. So we'll go through those. And then we'll also have some tips and best practices and then questions. All right. So I always like to start really any compliance program. Anytime you're talking about a compliance program, I like to start with the 7 elements of an effective compliance program. And I have a bonus 8th one on here, which I'll talk a little bit about. But essentially, so as you all probably know, in 2003, the OIG issued a compliance program guidance for pharma and device makers. It applies to device makers as well, where they outline these 7 elements. And it hasn't been updated since 2003, so 20 years later, we're still, it's still very alive and well. But there's been a push over the last 20 years, and not necessarily in the device space particular, but just in the healthcare compliance space, to add an 8th element. And there's even some debate as to what the 8th element should be or would be. I like to say compliance risk assessment is the 8th element, and I believe that it deserves its own number and its own element. So we will talk a little bit about that. It's not a new, compliance risk assessment is not new. It's not something that the government, they're not coming out and saying, oh, this is a new thing that you guys have to do. It really should be baked into all of these elements and baked into the compliance program. The risk assessment should drive all of the compliance activities at a company. And that's why I think it's so important that I put it out as the 8th one. So just quickly, I'll go through the policies. Obviously, we want to implement written policies and procedures. It's the paperwork is important, but it's also, we have to look beyond the paperwork, and that's what we're going to dive a little bit deeper in today. Designated a compliance officer and a compliance committee. Again, those are kind of check the box activities, but we'll talk a little bit more about compliance committee and how it functions and what to look for. Effective training and education. Again, that's been mentioned a couple times. Sales training is a huge one that you want to look at, but also just looking at the program, how often is training occurring? Are we training on the right topics? That kind of thing. Effective lines of communication. Do we have a hotline? Is there kind of an open door policy from a compliance perspective? Is the company conducting internal monitoring and auditing? We'll talk more about that. Enforcing standards through well-publicized disciplinary guidelines. So this is if we are making sure that if our policies are violated, which it's common, it will happen, that we're being consistent about disciplinary activity. Responding promptly to detected offenses and undertaking corrective action. So investigations, if a compliance issue arises, are we taking prompt action to address that? And then the last one, we'll talk about it more in depth, but just the risk assessment. Again, in my opinion, it's the kind of often forgotten portion of a compliance program, and it really should be more of a center of focus. All right, so why is compliance important in M&A? We have kind of already talked about all of this, but I'll just reiterate or reinforce. When you are buying a company, you're essentially adopting them into the family, and you want to know ahead of time what you're getting into. So in terms of diligence, you'll want to do some comprehensive vetting or digging, and just to make sure that if there are compliance gaps, that you're aware of them and can plan for them in terms of remediation efforts or potential risks that you're taking on. And we talked a little bit about liability. Obviously, consult your M&A attorney on the structure of the deal, but you could potentially be inheriting a lot of that liability from a litigation enforcement perspective, and we've seen that happen in OIG settlements, where a company will settle for 10 years after the conduct occurred, and they had been bought out by another company, but they still were potentially on the hook for the settlement. Valuation, so the value could be directly impacted by the status of the compliance program. If there are a lot of gaps, if it's an immature, kind of unsophisticated company and program, the value may decrease or be lowered accordingly to make up for that risk. So it's in the best interest of a potential target to make sure that they're taking action to have a robust compliance program in place. Even if they're not in an M&A stage right now, it's a good thing to think about in the future. And then just post-close remediation. So there's always going to be some things that you don't find, but you want to minimize the extent that you can, minimize surprises after the close, because there's always going to be something that has to be done, and just kind of knowing and planning for that, but doing what you can to minimize that risk, because it obviously takes time and resources. All right, so my 4 key inquiries. So these are lines of questioning that I think are more of an advanced level compliance program. So if a company can respond to these inquiries confidently, quickly, if they can talk to them, I propose that they have a pretty darn good, robust compliance program that's effective and actually functioning. And this is not that you should only ask these 4 questions. You still want to spend lots of time in the data room and use Mark's list of 20 questions as well. But yes, I tried to narrow it down. Of course, in the M&A context, sometimes time is limited and resources are limited. And if you only have a certain amount of time to do a deep dive, it's good to get kind of the most bang for your buck in terms of what you're looking for and how you can assess that. And you can also use this even if you are not a target or not if you're not looking to be purchased in the near future. It's a good exercise to go back and ask your teams at your companies these questions and kind of get a sense for what level of maturity, kind of how effective your program is now. All right, so here are my 4 inquiries, and we'll dive into each of them a little bit deeper. The first one sounds really simple: compliance committee meeting minutes and related materials for the last 2 years. And you can kind of pick 1 year, 2 year. I like 2 year. I feel like that gets a little bit of history, but that's typical. It'll go in the data room. The second one: what triggers the need for a compliance audit, and what does the company do with the results? So auditing, obviously, that's one of the elements of an effective compliance program, but we'll dive a little bit more into that inquiry or that line of questions. What triggers a compliance investigation? And then the last one, my favorite: describe how the company's compliance risk assessment process feeds into its compliance program. All right, so the first one, compliance committee meeting minutes. So this is kind of an easy one, or at least from the target's perspective. They can just put everything in the data room. So imagine you're doing diligence, you're in the data room, you're drilling down all the little files, and you get to the one that says compliance committee, and you open it up. And what are you looking for? I propose focusing on, well, first of all, just look at the documents. Are they written on a piece of scratch paper? Does it have a nice format? Can you follow when the meetings took place? Who was there? Just the format and kind of the sophistication of that tells you a lot about how the company values compliance and that committee process. Can you tell how often they met? If you ask for 2 years and there's two meeting packets, that means that they're probably not meeting regularly, or they just started meeting regularly. Who is at these meetings? Which functions are represented? That should be, the list of attendees should be in each of the meeting minute or packets. Is there a focus on training? Was there training done with the compliance committee on what their role is? That's also an important one that I think gets lost. Are the meetings anchored back to the 7 elements of an effective compliance program? I know it's kind of cliche and may seem elementary, but I like to start every compliance committee meeting with those elements, just to really anchor everybody. What kind of topics are discussed? Can you tell if it's more of a check the box activity, or are they actually getting into some of the meat of risk areas? Is there a substantive discussion, or are the meetings 15 minutes long, during lunch? Are there compliance metrics or KPIs that are being tracked, trended, discussed? Are there subcommittees? Subcommittees aren't required, but if there is a subcommittee under a compliance committee, It makes me think that they have had some forethought in terms of their scope and considered adding a subcommittee that would be a different scope slightly. So it just gives you a sense of how sophisticated their program is in terms of the structure. Are there action items listed? Are there follow-ups being made? So if one meeting has action items, in the next meeting, are they following up on those to make sure that it was closed out? These all seem simple, but it tells you a lot about how serious they take the compliance program. And I'm borrowing Mark's Goldilocks zone, his too hot, too cold here, just for fun. But so for too cold, say you open that data file or the data room file and there's nothing in there. That would be too cold. They don't maybe lack controls. Maybe there's no compliance officer, so it's kind of ad hoc. That would be lacking controls. If you open up the file and there's, some haphazard meeting minutes, maybe a couple meetings sporadically throughout the 2 years. Maybe they're not really having substantive discussions, but talking about, the next NSM or something. No trending, no follow-up. Those are all things that would be like, well, they have a process, they try, but they're not actually effective in practice. All right, so the next one, what triggers the need for a compliance audit and what does the company do with the results? So this would be a good one to have to talk live, especially if they haven't done audits. You can listen for the silence after the question. Sometimes, and I've had this happen where I ask a question like this and they bring up, oh, well, we had a quality audit or FDA audited us. And it's like, well, that's not quite what this is getting at, but that's good. So a lot of the response you can tell based on, or you can tell a lot of the status based on the response to this question. So things to consider, things to focus on when it comes to compliance audits. How often are they happening? Is it an annual thing? Are they setting up an annual plan and then executing to the plan? Or is it more of, oh shoot, June 1st, my Nevada filing is due, I better do an audit quick, which that happens, I get it, but just gives you a sense in terms of, are they planning? Are they taking a proactive kind of thoughtful approach to audits, or is it just as they think of it? Who is the auditor? Is it somebody internal? Is it independent? Is it somebody outside the company? Is the person qualified to do the audit? What areas are audited? Are they risk areas from the risk assessment, or are they just kind of whatever seems easy? How are audit findings handled? Are they documented somewhere? Are they discussed at the compliance committee? What happens after an audit finding? Is there a process in place? If corrective actions are taken, who's responsible for those? Is there tracking? Is there trending? Is there effectiveness checks on corrections? What's the timeline? Are there timing requirements for audits? Or do they just go on indefinitely? Does the company track metrics or KPIs related to auditing? That'd be a good thing to discuss at the compliance committee. Is there a tracking system? Or is it just, again, kind of whenever someone feels like an audit would be a good idea? Has outside counsel been involved or any other third-party consultant or expert in the area? Those are all kind of the things that I would look for in response to that question. So from a too cold, too hot perspective, if you ask that question and they look at you like they have no idea what you're talking about, then that probably means that they either have a lack of knowledge or you have an unsophisticated audience or company that has not done an audit. Or they will say, oh, well, we have a quality audit, which is not the same thing. Good, but not the same thing. And if a company does have audits, maybe they share some audit reports with you and you take a look at them and it's very piecemeal, or maybe there's no follow-up, there's no traceability from the finding to the corrective action. That could indicate that, well, they're doing the motions, they aren't actually, the program isn't actually effective. All right, what triggers a compliance investigation? So this would be another good one to speak verbally or over the phone and to get a sense of kind of their reaction. They should be able to rattle off pretty darn quickly their process for what triggers a compliance investigation, and then you can kind of probe from that question. So things to think about. Is there a policy? Is there an SOP in place that describes what happens if a compliance investigation is needed? And they may say, well, we've never had one, so we don't have a policy. Well, you want to have a policy or some process in place, because if the need arises, you don't want to have to be creating that at the same time that you're trying to resolve potentially a compliance issue. So being proactive, even if they haven't had one, haven't had an audit or hadn't had a need to have an audit, they should have a policy or a process in place. How often have you had compliance investigations? They're very common. There's nothing wrong with having investigations ongoing. If you have a lot of reports or questions that come up, it's a sign of a healthy compliance program, in my opinion, if there are investigations that are ongoing. So it's not necessarily something to be afraid of, but how many do you have? Are they frequent? Are they focused in certain areas? Are there repeat offenders? That kind of thing. What kind of documentation does the company keep for each investigation? Is it privileged? I will venture to say that all investigations should be done under privilege. So if they are able to just rattle off and hand you documents, that could be potentially a red flag. Who are the decision makers? So is there somebody within the business that has to kind of sign off on an investigation such that it's not very independent? Or is that the compliance officer that makes the sole decision, or legal? Is there an investigation team outlined in advance? There should be. Certain functions should be involved, and sometimes I see that broken out by the type of compliance issue. There should be independence. That should be an element in all investigations, that should be addressed in a policy or SOP. You don't necessarily have to use outside counsel or another vendor, but the person should have an element of independence. So the sales manager should not be investigating the sales rep. Timelines and promptness. So one of the elements, again, of an effective compliance program is prompt response to detected offenses. So if we identify something that may or may not be an issue, we have to investigate it promptly. Those timelines should be laid out. Depending on the complexity of the investigation, some take way longer and some are very fast. So if it does end up taking longer, you'd want to see something documented in terms of maybe deviating from the policy and rationale as to why. Again, this line of questions, I don't expect to get anything from the company because it should all be privileged, but they should be able to speak to all of this just in generalities. Effectiveness checks, so if there are corrective actions, if there's a response, if there's a disciplinary action, how do we make sure that the corrective action was effective and we're not going to have the same risk out there? And privilege, I just put that on there again. So from a hot-cold perspective, again, if you ask this question and they look at you like you don't know what they're talking about, and they don't have a policy, don't have a process, it's probably a sign that they may not have sufficient controls in place from a compliance perspective. If they have a policy, but they decide when they want to use it and who's involved, and depending on who the alleged violator is, they can decide whether to do an investigation or not. That's a sign that they have a process, but they're not following it. All right. So here's my last inquiry. That's my favorite. Describe how the company's compliance risk assessment process feeds back into its compliance program. It's a very loaded question, so it is a hard one to answer if you were asked on the spot. But just some things to think about. So a mature, compliance program A mature company that has a robust compliance program that's effective should be able to rattle off an answer to this fast. Again, the risk assessment, the risks that you identify should really drive all of decision-making and activities from a compliance program perspective. I like to think of it, I mean, it's very similar to traceability matrices in the design control space. You trace inputs to outputs, you trace hazards to mitigations. Like, we want to keep that consistency going, and that's what the government would expect to see. So things to focus on as you're probing this line of question: do they know their risk areas? Have they done an inventory? Have they documented it anywhere? Have they thought through kind of all the different areas? Is there a process in place for conducting a risk assessment? Do they have risk categories? A lot of the times when you'll do a risk assessment, you'll have categories that you kind of group things into. How do they come up with those categories? Risk rating or risk ranking. So asking them, please describe your approach to how you rate or rank these risks would be a good question. Typically, you would rank them based on probability of occurrence and severity of harm. There's other ways to do it. Frequency, so how, did they do a risk assessment 5 years ago and it's just sitting there and it hasn't been touched since? A risk assessment, for it to work, it has to be reviewed and revisited. If things change, risk rankings go up and down, and that should drive action in your compliance program. And it may mean that some things could be less controlled, or some areas you may want more controls. So follow-up, just reviewing it, updating it. It should be done on an annual basis, in my opinion. I think that's probably, and it's really not, it shouldn't be that big of a lift, but what functions, what personnel is involved? Is it just the compliance officer doing it? Or are they, interviewing people across the company to get a sense of other risks that they may be missing? Is there an escalation process if risk rankings change and maybe something is higher risk than it was? Who's the decision maker in terms of what to do if the risk rankings do change and one is higher all of a sudden? Who makes the decision in terms of what action needs to be done? So too cold, too hot. So the too cold, if they don't know what you're talking about, or if they start talking about risk management files on the FDA side, that's probably a sign that they have inadequate controls, or maybe they just lack knowledge about compliance programs and how they should function. Too hot would be, maybe they have a risk matrix or a risk inventory, but it's disconnected. It's just sitting there. There's no connection between risks identified and compliance controls. Lack of follow-up, missing key risks, those are all indicators that maybe they've checked the box, but they haven't actually gone through the exercise. All right. Just a few tips. I know a lot of these have been covered and will be covered again, but it's not hurt to reiterate. So for acquirers, interview staff across the company. I really do think that's a good idea. If for nothing else, just to get a sense of the culture. Probe questions about the compliance program. They should be able to answer pretty quickly, even if they're not in the compliance function. They should be able to discuss what the compliance program is and provide feedback from that perspective. You can learn a lot just from talking to different functions across the company. Don't forget to use publicly available means for diligence. Open payments is a good one. FDA warning letter database. There's lots of publicly available methods to do diligence in addition to the typical document review question. For targets, again, we're really on this train today. Do not share privileged information. And that comes up often, actually. So just be very cautious about that. Don't put anything in the data room or provide anything that's privileged. Engage your attorney for questions. Limit information disclosed. So typically there's a data room. Make sure you're using that and not, sending emails outside of that. If you're, getting asked questions, take credit for improvements that you've made. Take credit for things that, to Mark's point, he said, we like when we see something that was broken and then it was fixed. That's a good example of an effective compliance program. And then just be honest, respond accurately, completely, but you don't need to reveal everything. It's kind of the audit scenario where answer the question, answer honestly, and then stop talking. Tell the truth, answer, and then stop talking. Kind of like that, but all right. That was a lot. Any questions?
Online.
All right.
So the first one is, as far as individual responsible corporate officer doctrine goes, is it enough that the U.S. compliance officer, who is also a licensed U.S. attorney, advises in writing their notice to the global corporation of an activity by the global organization with regard to a U.S. HCP is illegal? Will the U.S. compliance officer be held accountable for global compliance program decisions, or will global non-U.S. employees be held accountable under a compliance once a compliance concern is raised?
Wow,
That was a long
That's
one.
a loaded
Sorry.
question. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of facts that we're missing out here. I don't know. I mean, so it sounds like the question is informing them of a risk and sufficient?
I think so.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it will depend on the issue, the countries that we're talking about, the role of the person's role in the company. I mean, I think voicing concerns is always good, and companies should encourage that, just from a culture perspective. But yeah, I mean, maybe we can talk offline, that person, to get a little bit more details. I don't want to give legal advice here.
Sounds good. And then there was one other. Do you recommend timeline/end dates for audits, or is it okay to have regular and ongoing audits so long as they're monitored and acted on?
That's a good question. So it kind of depends on the company and their preference and just how they operate. Some companies do much better if they have a calendar and they stick to it and they do their audits and they're done in, a month or whatever the timeline would be. It's fine to do either. I would say maybe even having a conversation at the beginning of the fiscal year about audits coming up and then having that be a topic of discussion at the compliance committee, I think that would be a good way to track. But yeah, I mean, I do think timelines are important. Essentially, we don't want an audit to start and then just never end and fall off, because that's ultimately what would happen, so. Yeah.
Is there any best practice around having a risk committee, like as a subcommittee of the compliance committee? Is that what most companies are doing?
Yeah, so actually, I don't see that as often. I think that would be really helpful. Usually the risk assessment or whatever the risk, if it's a risk inventory, it's treated kind of as a subcommittee of the compliance committee, but it's depending on if you have internal audit functions, so it kind of depends on the functions that you have. I really like that idea. And then they would report up to the compliance committee. I think that's a really good way to do it.
I assume, since this is privilege kind of stuff, that preventive corrective action, you wouldn't throw that in the quality CAPA system. You'd keep that within the compliance operation.
So when you're saying, are you talking about CAPA or like a corrective action from a compliance investigation?
A corrective action from a compliance
Okay.
investigation and the effectiveness check,
Yep.
kind of thing.
Yeah, so typically, I mean, in most scenarios, the investigation should be done under privilege. So really, if there's a memo with findings afterwards, that should be privileged. But there's a point probably where you want to make corrections to the broader business or the broader program that you can't keep everything under privilege, but you don't have to explain the reasons why necessarily without having that privileged information being shared. But yeah, it shouldn't be in with the QMS. It's not a CAPA record or anything. All right. Well, good. Well, if you have any more questions, I'll be around.
All right, thank you. Welcome back from the break. I hope you've all learned a lot and having a good time. I'm going to continue, obviously, on the theme of acquisitions and touch base a little bit on ad promo. But first, a little bit about myself. I've been with Gardner for just about 2.5 years now. Focus a lot in the FDA space, ad promo, submission work, clinical trials. Also do some compliance from a anti-fraud aspect. And I think ad promo is a very interesting area to work. There's a lot of culmination of different expertise that comes together, and so I think it's always a topic of interest. And so a little bit about the agenda today. The title, obviously, Get What You Paid For, right? And so not saying I'm going to guarantee you're going to get what you paid for out of this, but some considerations when you're going through this process to make sure that you do your best to result with claims that you want to make versus the claims you're stuck making. And so I'm going to begin with an ad promo refresher, set the base for why it's so important that you understand what you can say because of the regulations, because of the breadth the government has to probe and prod. And then kind of focus in two areas of getting what you paid for: pre-acquisition considerations, and then post-acquisition, right? Once you get something, it's not done, right? You can do more, but we live in a quarter-by-quarter world, and so it might not be good enough to do more 5 years later, right? You might need to think about quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, and so what it might look like to develop claims after an acquisition that maybe you missed out on pre-acquisition. A brief is even too big of a word for how much I'm going to touch on this, as Jesse already has, but a brief enforcement update, end with some key takeaways, and then have some times for questions if there are any. So I do have a poll myself for the audience, and it's, have you ever been involved in a purchase where the resulting claims fell short, right? So this is I thought I was getting X, it went through my own process, and they said, no, you can say why. Show of hands here first. No, who's not had that happen to them, that they were in acquisition and they ended up with the claims they wanted? Great. Anyone has had that happen? Are there any yeses in the room? Sandra, Mark, got some other individuals. All right, so a few, and then not sure. Is anyone not quite sure? Which is also, I put that up there because it's totally possible, given the amount of conversation that goes on during an acquisition and the way the targets change, right? It totally is understandable that it might have been not sure, and you made it work the best you could. I'll also pause for online.
Yep. So 59% said no, 18% said yes, and 24% said not sure.
Good. So about 40% potentially have had this, and the 60% who has it, it might happen. So maybe you'll still learn something. So remember the ad promo refresher. Many of us are experts, but it's important to lay the foundation for what's coming next. And so, what is labeling? What is labeling that is regulated, that it's under the FDA and FTC, right? But we're really focused on FDA, and it's the definition of labeling that's been applied to the device. And it's broad, right? A display of written, printed, or graphic material upon the immediate container of any article. That has been broadly interpreted. And so remember, it's almost anything you say or put out there about your medical product. And you can see accompanying such article, both 201K, 201M, and then a little bit further, the Ninth Circuit that we all know about, how broad that has been interpreted. Most, if not all, advertising is labeling. And I would argue that, if not, that most word at first is just in case, right? You pretty much treat all advertising as labeling. And so remember that. Remember all those communications you want to put out about the thing you just bought is labeling, and it's going to be regulated as such. And so now what do we do with that knowledge? And I like to include this slide because this slide doesn't tell us a lot, right? It says misbranded drugs and devices. A drug or device is deemed to be misbranded if it has a false or misleading label, right? That doesn't give you a test. It doesn't tell you what is false, which is a little bit easier, but misleading is more difficult, right? There's a lot of ways things can be misleading. And when you take the breadth of what labeling is combined with the ambiguity here on what mislabeling really tells us, as you can see, the government's ability to take issue with things is quite broad. It doesn't mean they're doing it all the time, but it can be, right? You can come under the guise. It could be an audit, too. I also like to point out, it may not be just that the FDA is coming, but someone acting as a regulator in an audit is going to ask these questions, and you still have the same tests that you're going to go against. And some examples of false or misleading statements, right? So as you're looking to acquire a product, what are you going to be looking for yourself if you're on the buying side to, have a light bulb go off and say, oh, this could be a misleading statement that I don't think we'd be able to make at the time. And so, incorrect or half-true statements regarding the drug or the device or its outcomes, half-true is really important. It's, it does X. This product is for epilepsy. Oh, it's for epilepsy of a certain type in a certain stage, right? So you make that broad statement because you're trying to draw in. You haven't given the full indication. And there's actually been some warning letters and a couple of years ago where that was part of FDA's, concern is, hey, you said diabetes and you didn't say that it was, type 2 diabetes. So you're misleading your audience. You're misleading the consumer. You're misleading even the physicians on what they should use. Unsubstantiated claims, this goes both to FTC and FDA. If you are looking for a claim on clinical outcomes and it's based on, anecdotal evidence, you're not really substantiating it, right? So you've got to really say, hey, I saw this brochure that said 80% efficacy. What's this based on? Oh, well, we talked to 10 doctors and 8 really said this was a great product, right? That's unsubstantiated claim. I think superiority is also a really difficult one. Everyone wants to make competitive claims, but nobody really wants to do a head-to-head trial because if you fail, right, you can't bury trials. They're reported. If you fail, now you've got the opposite effect. And so there's not a lot of head-to-head trials out there, but there's a lot of companies making superiority claims, right? So a little bit out of balance. So if you're doing your due diligence, look at that. Look at, is it misleading with a competitive claim, or are they giving you data points of similar devices and they're giving you context, right? And we can talk about more later. We'll talk about context. But that's important on your misleading analysis is what context is there. Ambiguous claims creating an implied claim. I often think of this as a picture, right? You've got a device for some end-stage disease, and the picture is someone running, right, or hiking up a hill, right? The implied claim there is, hey, patient, like you might get here, but we have zero evidence that that would ever occur. And so even if it's not an overt claim, there's just enough that that patient could look at that and say, you know what, I'm miserable. I need that. I want to get up that mountain. I want to run that marathon. But there was no expectation, right? That's an implied claim. That ambiguity really made it difficult on the audience. Subjective statements that can't be substantiated. I think of a gift of God, something like that. That's great to put out there in certain areas, but what does that mean, right? It's really, you've got to think on how you're able to tailor that. Life-saving, is it a device that actually saves lives, or is that just a subjective statement to that person? Their life changed so much they just felt like it was life-saving, but let's be honest, it is not a life-saving device. Maybe it's a class 2. Withholding of material facts, I think this one really goes well with the FDA guidance in the June 2018, consistent with like what clinical context are you providing when you are making a claim? Because to withhold certain facts, it's a single-arm study, but you don't say that, right? So people are thinking, oh, you've got some conclusion, you've got some efficacy outcome claims, but that's a single-arm study with not enough patients, with not enough statistical analyses to give you an outcome, right? There's no hypothesis testing. That is a material fact that's withheld, where you allow the audience to kind of make that jump to their own conclusion. And then physician and patient testimonials. The easiest way to stay compliant there is to treat those testimonials like you would other statements you make, right? Is it consistent with your labeling? Do you have evidence that you would expect patients to have the outcome that the patient you're putting on the podium is having, right? If you've got 10 patients who've lost all pain and you don't have that in your clinical evidence, you're misleading the audience, right? So it's important that you think of all these different areas. And there's other areas, but these areas of potential misleading statements when you're looking at a company you're buying or when you're making your own on the seller side, right? Am I putting out statements that violate this? Or am I able to check each one of those and say, yeah, we're staying within these confines? So consequences, I'm not going to touch long. The list is quite a bit. And I think, in the sense that we're speaking, the consequence could be from a seller standpoint, someone's not going to buy you, right? Your market valuation has been built on false or misleading statements potentially, and someone's a little bit cold to go after you. Or from the acquisition side, your consequence could be you're valuing it because you saw their statements, that could treat X population, but once it went through your own compliance team, your own MLR review team, that was not the case. So now you've overjudged, you've underjudged, that's, applicable to this, but also these are not without impact, right? If you don't get bought, but you get a warning letter, it's not like, oof, they bought me, but I only have a warning letter, right? Those are still very impactful, and I know they've been touched on today. So acquiring the claims, not just the product. And I start with this because it's important to note that you can still create claims in the future, right? But if it's a PMA, that could be a 3 to 5 year process, right? So in the near term, you are acquiring the claims. The things that you can say about the product now, that's what you're going to have to sell when you get started. Your first quarter, your second quarter, that's what you have to focus on. And so what does it take to have a marketable claim, right? Once again, we know how broad a claim is. Well, it's got to be on-label / consistent with your labeling. It has to be substantiated. This is both FDA and FTC. And then it needs to be presented with proper context, right? If you can do those things, you're going to most likely have a marketable claim. And you're going to be able to use those claims to further increase the value, right, of your device, of your drug, of whatever it might be. So what are some considerations in the pre-acquisition space to result in a marketable claim that meets your company needs? Well, there's a few things. Let's first think about the regulatory status of whatever product you're going to acquire. It's important to note maybe it's not been cleared, or maybe it has been cleared or approved, but what pre-submission discussions with the FDA have occurred, right? The FDA is going to give very specific feedback in a pre-submission, and that pre-submission may have confidential information that's not shared, but the essence of the feedback from FDA can be shared, and that might be, hey, we don't think that this product is going to get this claim unless you do an RCT with 500 patients, right? So you can know buying it that if you want this claim, FDA has already given a pretty clear indication of what it takes for that next claim. Or has FDA said, hey, the type of 510K you seek is never going to give you this indication. You're going to need a full new 510K eventually to seek those claims you want, right? So those pre-submissions are going to give really good nuggets of information about how you're going to move forward and how you're going to know whether or not, you're going to end up with those claims. And then, approved or cleared. Obviously, one of the first questions you're going to ask is this already approved or cleared? Can I market the device? And in doing so, what is the risk tolerance? So you're buying a device that's already been approved or cleared. What is the risk tolerance of the seller in relation to your own risk tolerance? And I often think, I'm not picking on startups because startups are important, right? But startups sometimes have a different risk tolerance. They have to get their product known. Physicians are dealing and patients are dealing with thousands of products, thousands of drugs, right? And so they might be making provocative statements to be noticed. Now, you might come along as a more established company and see those same statements and say, oh, our risk tolerance is quite different. And so now, while they have approval or clearance, the things that they've been marketing, the things that caught your eye, they shouldn't have been saying. And it's their risk tolerance differentiation that led to that. So if they haven't been approved or cleared, you've got to think about the current stage. And has FDA raised concerns? Are they a 510K product about to go submit a 510K, and they've had good discussions? They've had pre-submissions with FDA, and FDA said, okay, if X, Y, and Z are true in your testing, this is going to be your indication. Here's some claims you're going to have. Then you have pretty good confidence that, yeah, in 90 days or maybe 180 days with a little bit of time for question and answer from FDA, you're going to get a device that's going to be able to make those claims. Has FDA raised concerns that, hey, you might get clearance, but we're going to knock some of these back, right? You're going to get a very generic, a very general clearance, and that's just what we're going to give. You need to do more work. You need to do more testing if you want to get a different indication, a different clearance, a different approval for a PMA. So you've got to really understand, just because it's approved or cleared, there's still a lot of questions and a lot of feedback FDA may have given that's going to temper the resulting claims. And then I say indication, right? So what is the regulatory status you're acquiring? Well, what is the indication? That's it, right? Your indication is going to tell you so much about how you're going to impact the marketplace. I like to think of general versus specific indications. Take, for example, ablation. And I'm using an example that's I've never seen because I'm going to go a little different here. But you have a device that ablates nervous tissue. Well, you're a company that's really interested in epilepsy, right? So you say, hey, this ablates nervous tissue. We know that there are certain nerves, especially for general epilepsy, that if we can stop the transmission, right, that spread of the signal in the brain, we can more focalize that epilepsy and avoid generalized tonic-clonic, just for example. So I'm going to buy this product. I'm going to buy this product that ablates nervous tissue, and I'm going to promote it for epilepsy. Time out. You've bought a product that only ablates nervous tissue. It has no nexus to epilepsy at this point. So your model, your sales reps who know epilepsy, who know the neural space, they're not going to know what to do with this product without promoting it in an off-label manner, right? So not only did you buy a product that you're not going to be able to do much with, you've also brought a product where the sales reps are going to be put at risk almost instantaneously because they're going to do what they know to impact the marketplace, but what they know is not allowed, right? So indication, 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 then matching the capabilities you are buying. If that indication says it does X, but the capabilities are much broader, that's fine. Just note that. Know what you're going to have to start and start planning for how you're going to get the most out of the device capabilities through additional regulatory submissions. And then claim substantiation. So how are they substantiating the claims that they can make? Do they have clinical studies? Are they clinical studies FDA reviewed? Right? It's nice to be peer reviewed, but have they gone to FDA and FDA says, yep, that's a good study, right? That's going to give you the utmost confidence that you're going to come out and be able to promote on those studies. The strength of the clinical studies. Sometimes, startups don't have a ton of money, right? Doing a study with 200 subjects of implanted devices is really expensive and time consuming. Maybe they had 10 patients in a single arm study and they've been messaging based off that because it's consistent with their evidence. But that messaging really needs to be put in context of the type of study they have. And so you may have seen a sales sheet that says 80% efficacy, and it's based on 8 out of 10 patients, right? You're not going to be able to claim that type of efficacy based on that type of profile. So really think about, yes, they've got a clinical study, but what was the strength of it? And then, important consideration is published. Is it a internal, kind of a white paper type piece, or at least was it peer reviewed? That gives you a little bit more confidence that you're going to meet those scientific standards of FDA and FTC when it's been peer reviewed, when a peer has looked at it, a journal has looked at it and said, yep. It's a little bit more interesting too with peer reviewed. You do have to think about paid journals sometimes versus some of our more traditional journals. There can be a little bit of variation on the strength of a journal. And so, keep those considerations in mind. And then preclinical studies. Preclinical studies are important. FDA likes a lot of testing before you go into humans. But if that's the sole basis for your claims, you need to understand that your claim is not a clinical claim. You can't extrapolate preclinical studies to clinical results. And so you're going to have to temper your claims based on that preclinical nature, right? It might be modeling, it might be rabbit studies, rat studies, which I said is not that the science is bad, it's that the resulting claim isn't as strong as human evidence. And I hit on this earlier, but competitive claims, head-to-head data, are they making competitive claims and do they have actual head-to-head data? Because if those are true, then that's a great product. If it's not true, still could be a good product, but your superiority, your competitive claims are probably not going to be as strong. So sold. So now you've bought, right? And I'm really thinking from the buyer side. Now you've bought the product, you've bought the drug, you've bought the medical device, the medical food, whatever it might be, you've made that purchase. And you're like, uh-oh, we didn't get exactly what we needed. And, not the end of the world, right? But what do you do now? And how do you develop further claims? And so you can do clinical studies, right? You can initiate clinical studies. And what I have on the bullets here is to think about not how you do the study, but the timing and the impact on to when you can make that claim. So is the clinical study you need just to bolster, right? We talked about that single-arm study of 10 subjects. Do you need to bolster that study? And so you're going to do an on-label post-market study, right? So you say, hey, if we can get this protocol written and we can find some sites, we can be pretty quick in instituting this, right? We don't need FDA involvement necessarily. Unless you're going to do a labeling change, you may want to do a pre-sub. But if you're just looking to bolster evidence consistent and you're going to be able to use your same labeling, that's a pretty quick path, right? And you can even get reimbursed in a post-market space much easier than in some of the IDE spaces. Is it an off-label? Do you need an off-label study? Do you need to change your labeling to get the claim you want? Not the end of the world, right? People change labeling all the time, but the timing really is important. And then, is it a non-significant risk or a significant risk study? And I put those two specifically because that's where a lot of companies really try to convince themselves one way or another. And so if you have a significant risk study, that means you're going to go to FDA and you're going to have FDA walk you with you through the IDE. They're going to have to approve your IDE, and you're going to have a little bit more, .28 documentation required than you would under a non-significant risk study, which has abbreviated requirements. And the amount of time needed to get to a resulting claim is going to be different. So you shouldn't make your assessment of a significant risk or non-significant risk. I know marketing has done that to me based on the time they need it, but really it's know what it takes if the claim is going to come from a significant or a non-significant risk study, because the timelines and being upfront with your business and your marketing team is really going to be important. And finally, literature. You can get literature, you can use literature to get claims, but it's going to have to be consistent with your approved or cleared labeling. And, that's something that is a little bit gray sometimes. And so I put this slide in here, and I think it's really important that when you are making an assessment on a new claim, that if you're going to use this consistent with guidance, this is the June 2018 consistent with guidance, that you actually write this down. You do an internal memo. You do something to show to a regulator, to the governmental body, that, yep, I considered these factors, and here's why we're making this claim, because it is consistent with our evidence, right? So you have to, and I say essentially the same, it's kind of my paraphrasing, but indication, patient population, limitations and directions for handling and use, dosing or use regime, administration, that's just one part of the determination. But if you can answer yes for those, then you can go to the next, factor. Does it increase the potential for harm, right? So if you're using all on this, the first four, sub-bullets under number one are the same, but for some reason you've got a different risk profile, FDA is going to say time out. We want to see more evidence. We want to see it in part of a labeling change. And finally, are your current directions for use adequate? Are you able to just send that same IFU out that you already do, and you're going to promote that study, and a physician's going to get it and say, oh, this study has this subpopulation, it fits this, and I know how to do it and use this device or prescribe this drug in that population. Then you can have a pretty strong argument that, yep, this is consistent with, I've just garnered a new claim that didn't require FDA involvement, and I've got documentation if I'm asked, here's why I'm comfortable allowing my sales team to use this claim. So I think it's really important, and I don't see it enough, but if you are going to use that consistent with guidance, write it down and show the work beforehand, and then go ahead and use it. And so I'm pretty close to time here. I'm not going to really touch base on this more than saying FTC warned companies on substantiation, right? If you pass FDA muster on substantiation, you're going to pass FTC muster. So to me, this is part of a little bit of FDA is a little overwhelmed. And so if you're kind of on notice from FTC, you're also on notice from FDA. And, what they're telling you is, hey, we're starting to look into this again. And so just note, if substantiation is light, and because you haven't seen FDA take any enforcement action on something like this for 10 years in the medical device space, doesn't mean you're in the clear from a risk assessment anyways. They're starting to put out notice that this is important. So actions for this audience, right? Just be aware. Just be aware that if there's no substantiation, you can't look the other way and say, well, we need that claim, right? Have a plan to get that substantiation to support that claim. Just a couple of key takeaways. Understand the claims you can make, not the claims you want to make, right? You need to have your desired for, but when close comes and when you're putting that development plan to your business and say, here's what the uplift we're going to get, know what you're able to make, because that's what you're going to be able to rely on, and that's how you're going to be able to meet your goals. Have a plan to receive additional claims as necessary. Even before you've bought it, start getting your clinical folks and your regulatory folks engaged if possible, right? Sometimes there's certain reasons you can't. But if you're able to have folks on that side, start thinking ahead of what would it look like to add additional claims? What would our timelines be? Because you can build those in, and then you can have senior leadership understanding, it might be 2 more years, but we've planned ahead and it's worth it. Finally, this is all to say you need compelling and compliant material, statements, marketing, because if you're not compliant, it's compelling, you're going to get in trouble. And if it's compliant but not compelling, you're not going to get your message out. So, the whole purpose of all this is to meet marketing, legal, regulatory, clinical, all in one spot to end up with that messaging. I appreciate your time. I'm happy to take any questions. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Paul. Any questions?
So if a clinician gives a presentation at a conference and they say, in my practice, I have seen, and then they start making a few claims that may be a little beyond the manufacturer, is the manufacturer at risk in that situation?
So generally, you're not at risk right away if a physician kind of speaks on their own and says something, right? You know, this is where your training of that physician is going to be important, because you're going to show, hey, we taught them how to message on label. And it's going to be, how did you act afterwards? If they're messaging something off label, you know, you can have out a notice, you know, just remember, you know, a reminder, here's our indications, here's what we're indicated for, here's our evidence, right? Because you know, you can't rely on putting a physician on stage and saying, hey, we paid him, but we're not in charge, right? That's not okay. But physicians do sometimes misstep because their practice of medicine goes beyond, you know, what the industry can say. It's how you prepare beforehand and how you react after that'll really give you your best ability to defend against any concerns there. All right, I don't see anything else. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here and online. We're happy to have you. I'm excited to share with you about privacy and cybersecurity diligence, some best practices on that, and some other considerations around that topic. I practice primarily in privacy at Gardner. We do a lot of work with HIPAA-covered entities, business associates, and all other aspects of privacy. As you know, there's a number of laws, whether it's GDPR in Europe or state laws, the CCPA and others, that directly affect our clients. So we're involved in advising on those. So let's dive in here. So just to give you a little bit of a background on what's happening in privacy, I'm going to do a little landscape kind of, what is going on around the US in particular. A lot of things are happening, so we'll talk about that briefly. Just to give a snapshot, we'll talk about some impact on M&A that has had and will continue to have. And then we'll also talk about what are some pitfalls that might come up during the M&A process, whether that's pre-close, during diligence, and so forth. How to avoid those pitfalls, and then get into some examples briefly of things you might ask or might be asked if you're on the selling side as you go through diligence. Then some quick takeaways. So just to kind of give some context, there are several state laws in the US now that cover comprehensively all personal data. Generally, they accept HIPAA-covered entities and so forth, but pretty much all personal data. We've seen those in California, Utah, Virginia, Connecticut. The list goes on, Colorado. And in the past couple of months, we've also seen regulations finalized in California and Colorado. A law in Iowa passed as well and signed into law. So there's a lot of action on this going on. And on the addition, just the past 2 weeks, we've had Tennessee pass a new comprehensive privacy bill. Texas almost passed one. You'll see in your printed slides that we initially thought it was passed, but there was some correction. They actually went back to the House for additional amendments. But again, lots of activity going on. Washington State just passed the My Health, My Data Act a couple of weeks ago as well, which is designed to kind of correct the gaps that HIPAA creates around patient privacy that's not covered by HIPAA. So there's a significant shift that's happening in the US in particular right now around this. We don't have any clear sign of a federal law. We thought we might have one as recently as last year, but it's just the traction has not happened to get that to happen yet, but we'll keep an eye on that. And obviously, cybersecurity is always a hot topic. We never seem to get away from that. Breaches continue to occur regularly. In fact, according to some research, we've hit recently, at least in the past few years, really a high in March this year of cybersecurity attacks. And healthcare is obviously a very valuable sector for those attacks, so that continues to be a major area of risk for healthcare companies. Just a couple of examples of recent breaches in the healthcare space. I think it's helpful to think about these, even though we know they happen, but just to remember these continue to happen. It's the reality. They're very expensive. Average cost, according to recent research, for a healthcare breach is over double other breaches in other sectors, simply because of the sensitivity of information, the requirements around reporting and investigation and so forth. As much as 10 million is estimated on average to the cost of a data breach. And obviously, that'll be affected by a lot of factors. So in these two cases, we had one in the District of Columbia, the health exchange there, where the insurance exchange, there was a breach of those records impacting even congressmen. So the FBI was involved reportedly in investigating that. Significant breach. And then also in February, Sharp Healthcare in California also had a breach. In that case, it was essentially a website vulnerability that led to billing-related information being exposed. So it wasn't all of their patient information, but certain records tied to that website. So again, it's an all-encompassing cybersecurity program is necessary to deal with some of these risks. So what does this all mean for M&A? There's a lot of privacy and cybersecurity things happening, but what about how does that impact the M&A landscape? So on the first bullet here, you'll see obviously, really obviously, I think we all think about breaches. We think about non-compliance with all of these privacy laws. Those create risk, right? So there's the risk of enforcement post-close against the acquiring company, and how does the liability for that play out? There could be valuation or risk allocation issues that are directly impacted by maybe privacy gaps. There could be immense costs to remediate some risks. There might even be devices or products that are impacted by vulnerabilities or security risks or privacy issues. There could also be a significant cost to remediate those. So those, if they're unexpected, that could significantly affect the acquiring company and the value of that deal for them. There might also be unexpected data use limitations. So you may find that an acquiring company is looking at a target, and maybe a particular asset is data that they've collected or processed, clinical trial data, other data, maybe a CRM. What if that was not collected lawfully? Maybe the consent doesn't permit the company that's being acquired to offer that data up to the acquiring company. Maybe there's a lack of consent to that processing. Or maybe the intended purpose for that data that the acquiring company has isn't congruent with the consent that's been signed. Those can all create issues. Product or IT system vulnerabilities. So if you have a medical device that is a connected device, significantly increases the cybersecurity risk. Or maybe there's a product that's a service, so it's hosted online in Amazon or some other web service. Those products, if they're not secured properly, could be significantly devalued by a security incident or a lack of controls there. So you can see how there's a significant impact to M&A from these rules and from these risk areas. So just to give some examples, I think most of you are probably familiar with these companies, but there's a major, these are just major examples of how privacy and cybersecurity have impacted deals in the past. And no doubt there are dozens of other impacts, but these have made the headlines. In one example, Marriott decided to acquire Starwood Hotels. In that process, they did diligence, they did their normal activities. And it wasn't until the 2016 acquisition and then 2 years following that Marriott, I assume, had implemented enough controls to identify that there had in fact been a breach in 2014, prior to the acquisition occurring. And when they finally discovered it, they had to report it, and since then there's been ongoing litigation, enforcement actions, and so on. It's been costly, to say the least. We'll talk a little bit about some ways that those kinds of risks might be mitigated, even if you can't necessarily get the fact that a breach occurred from the party if they don't know, but you can get into some of the controls there. Similarly, Yahoo was acquired by Verizon in 2017, and I think this is illustrative of just the kind of impact that these vulnerabilities and in this case, data breaches can have on the value of a deal. In this case, it was an 8% discount, $350 million of a major deal because of 2 data breaches that Yahoo had to disclose to Verizon during the diligence process. And in addition to that, cash liabilities were split related to the ongoing litigation that would occur afterwards. So there's almost always consumer litigation following a breach, and this is one example of that. So both of these, I think, are showing us some things that we can think about as we dig into what would be good diligence to address these issues. What are some pitfalls, then, that might come up if we were to go into one of these deals without kind of thinking through all of those ramifications? Are we asking the right questions? Are we digging into the details of maybe key risk areas? What if there's a key asset that the company that we're looking to acquire, the target company, have we considered what those risks might be and how to address them in diligence? Have we valued the controls themselves and the implementation of those controls? Or are we only looking for data breaches? If they say, well, no data breaches, are we good? Probably not. We'll talk about that more. But there's a lot of risks that are elevated when the controls are weak. For example, not knowing that a breach even occurred. That may also lead to costly remediation and so on. Also, not understanding the data and how the data is flowing within the organization that's a target could lead us to not know whether that data is usable, what it's usable for, what sort of controls are in place to process that data, whether it was even legally acquired in the first place. Those sorts of questions should be considered in the process of thinking about M&A. Also, what about third-party relationships? Do we ask about those? What if there's a key or critical vendor that supports a product or a service or an operating element of the business that's critical? Do they have the right security and privacy controls? Has that been discussed? So if we kind of miss any of these, obviously there's the potential for significant risk for the acquiring company. So what are some things we can do to avoid these risks? I'll go through 6 different things that I think are really the highlights or top priorities to think about when you do this sort of activity. So obviously you need a team that's going to know what they're doing and what they're looking for. But along with that, you have your IT, your privacy counsel, your cybersecurity experts, those folks that can think through the details of these questions and what the risks might be, but also communicate with that team what are the goals and strategic targets of that acquisition process, because ultimately they're going to look at what they think is valuable or high risk to the company. That might be general program things. It might also be product specific. What if there's a specific product that's the target of the acquisition? Is that product secure? Is it set up properly under a privacy program? Understand the target company's risk profile, and this goes directly to what level of diligence will you do? So is there large repositories of health information? Is it a company that's involved in, say, a reimbursement support program where there's significant patient data? How is that set up? Is it lawfully organized? What about a product that is in the cloud and involves direct access to patient information on an ongoing basis? That could be directly relevant to the risk profile of that company. Are they operating in jurisdictions across the globe, or is it local, in the US only? Do they have are there ducks in a row around those topics? So all of those things could affect the risk profile and should be considered when you scope then how that diligence is approached. So depending on that risk profile, you may want to dig into, deeply into certain categories of questions and inquiries. I'll give some examples of those shortly. Or you might simply want to give a shorter list or more broad questions if you find, okay, this is a low-risk target. If it's a high-risk target, there's going to be a lot more interest, I think, in interviewing, say, the Chief Information Security Officer, Privacy Counsel, folks who are in the know or understand the company's risk internally a little bit better and can speak to those things. Obviously, you'll want to look more at the policies and procedures as well, more deeply, especially if it's a high risk target. So we'll also want to focus those diligence efforts then on the key kind of assets or the operational aspects of the business that are most critical. So you might look at specifically if there's, say, a set of clinical data that's embedded at the company that is part of the value of the acquisition. What if that data set isn't usable? I've run into this where post-close, you're asked, okay, we have this patient consent and we have this set of data and we want to use it for X. And you have to evaluate, okay, is this consent going to allow you to do that? Or was it limited to that original study and that's it? So there's some risk around that, and diligence efforts can only look at those things if the person doing the diligence knows, oh, this is what the purpose of the acquisition or one of the targets of the acquisition involves. So that's key as well. Additionally, I think a key question is always to not only understand whether breaches have occurred, but also what sort of security incident response framework is in place to detect those incidents. If there is a framework, has it ever been used? Are there any examples of it? Has it been tested? If it's not used, that's obviously a red flag that maybe they don't even know if they have breaches. Again, harkening back to the Marriott Starwood example. Look at the key documentation that the company has in place. Ask for the privacy policy. And I stop on that term. We often think of privacy policies as, okay, I go to the website, I scroll down to the bottom, and I ignore these all the time, but you click on the privacy policy, and then you read, we value your personal information. We love you because you're a customer. We take care of your data, all those things. We practice good security principles reasonably, the lawyers say. So all that stuff is in there. Is that enough? Generally, no. So if we're asking about a company's privacy program, we want to understand not what they tell you they do, but what is their internal policy, their procedure that governs that program. So if I'm in marketing, what is it that I have to do? What process do I have to go through to collect 50,000 patients' information and run a campaign? What sort of privacy implications will that have inside the company? So that's what you'd be looking for, is things like that, documentation like that. It should reference applicable laws, things that speak to the company's understanding of where they are, what their risk profile is themselves, and gives you a clue of, okay, they actually are doing what they need to be doing. Other than that, going deeper than those written documents, yes, they might have a great program on paper. I'm also looking into, do they actually do these things? They might say they do regular, audits, penetration testing, whatever it is in their policies and procedures, but you can ask for artifacts to prove that. Do they have a scope and date of their most recent pen test for a key product or system? They won't give you probably the findings from that pen test, but they'll tell you, yeah, we did one. They'll proudly say we did it on July 1st, 2022, and here's the scope of that audit. If they don't have it, you'll find out. Also, you can easily look at key data protection language in contracts, whether it's with vendors or customers. You can understand, are they promising things to customers in their products and services agreements that they can't comply with based on your other diligence? Those things can become critical risks if their customer base is, 50 major health systems and they aren't compliant with those agreements. That could be a major risk in going into that acquisition. So a few other considerations. You might go into a deal thinking, we'll purchase the company and the data will just flow right into our hands. We'll be in control, and from that point on, we're the data controller. But what if there's some services in the meantime that this acquired company needs to provide? So maybe they're in the middle of maybe transitioning data from one data store to another. Maybe there's some unification of data sets that needs to happen. So you need a services agreement. But what if now that company, are they the data controller? Are you the data controller? Many privacy laws have that principle now, even in the US. So is there proper language in place now to deal with that? Reps and warranties, we've all talked about those a little bit, but from a privacy standpoint, are they consistent with the risk profile? So if you've evaluated what laws apply to this company, what sort of risks are present from a data breach standpoint, and so on. Does the rep and warranty align with that, or are there missing pieces, as Mark mentioned in his presentation? Also, a big issue is who's liable if there is a breach. The title of this presentation is "Whose Data Breach Is It Anyway?" And the key question is, whose is it? You may not know unless you carefully think through, how is this structured with an M&A attorney? How is this structured so that the liabilities aren't solely on me as the acquiring company afterwards? What if we do all this diligence and they don't disclose a breach? Are we responsible then? Make sure that you have coverage, at least to mitigate some of that risk, although you won't be able to probably eliminate it. Then finally, what about integration of the company's privacy or cybersecurity programs? Well, what will that cost? What parts of the target company's remediation should occur pre-close? Maybe there's some things you feel like they need to do before you close, and should you hold them to that? We've seen examples of that with clients where the strategic's talking to them and they have to get their ducks in a row before the strategic will sign the papers. So there's some situations like that as well. And ultimately, how will you structure the programs that you have in place to make sure that the acquiring company and the target company can mesh well afterwards? Plan for that, because from a privacy and cybersecurity standpoint, that can be difficult. Maybe there's a very sophisticated acquiring company and the target company has to get up to speed, and there can be a significant cost in mapping all of the data, inventorying that, understanding where all of those systems are, and if risk assessments, all those things. So there can be a lot of planning involved in that. So just to share some examples, I won't read through these, but there are a lot of diligence requests that we've seen. Usually these get targeted at, say, covered entities under HIPAA. When GDPR is invoked, there's different reasons why strategics or investors would look at these things. But lots of different questions we've seen come through. Usually these would be questions that you would provide data in a data room, for example, and they'd pore over it, follow up with questions. You might have interviews following that. But this is something that you would look to ask or prepare to be asked if you're on the selling side. So also there might be interview questions, and I think this is a good idea if you're on the acquiring side, is to look carefully at who in the company would be appropriate to interview on the target side. Just would it be the privacy officer? Do they have one? If not, who is responsible for that kind of activity or cybersecurity activity? It's common in small companies not to have a designated by title privacy officer, and somewhat more common but still unusual to have a cybersecurity, a CISO, a chief information security officer. So those are titles might not be there, but who is the person that's responsible for this? Is there a structure? Talk through those things and dig in deeper in those conversations. Find out whether the policies and procedures are used. Look at, for example, is there any review of the policy? Was it released 5 years ago and then never touched again? Does it reference responsibilities? Are those people that are referenced actually in the company? Do they have someone that's got the title of privacy officer, if that's what the policy references? Look at those things and dig in a little bit. And always dig into data breach issues. Those can be difficult to dig through, but if there's no cybersecurity incidents at all that the company can report, that can be a problem, just because almost every company has something that has occurred if they have a process to identify it. But if there's no process, it's very likely they will say, well, nothing's happened in the last 5 years, and that's a rarity. Generally, something's happened. So just to wrap up briefly, again, understand what is the risk, the profile of that company that's the target company. More and more, I think that risk profile is going to broaden to the point where most companies have some level of risk around privacy and cybersecurity. Probably lower, of course, with, say, it's just a manufacturer that's building a product and selling it directly to hospitals. But more and more, even those companies will be carrying lists of consumer data, things like that clinical trial data, et cetera. You might also, you should also have the right people in place. Just make sure that the team that is assembled aligns with that risk profile so that you actually have the right questions being asked. Also make sure that the key risk areas, those areas that most likely would impact the deal or the value of the deal or create risk for the company down the road, are focused on. Go deeper than just the written policies. Make sure that there's any sort of artifacts that you can look at, whether it's consent forms or data protection agreements, et cetera, that those are looked at as well. And finally, I think this is one of the most critical things, of course, but just who is going to be liable if there is a data breach or some non-compliance. Confirm that that is addressed. Work with your M&A attorneys and privacy attorneys to look through those details, because that really can be a significant area of risk. And diligence can help, but it can't completely negate those risks. That's it from me. Any questions? All right. Perfect. I'll hand it off to the panel. And Mark.
Okay, great. Chris, thanks again for the Yacht Rock. Enjoying that very much today. Okay, so we're going to have our panel session here, and this will go about 30 minutes, and then we'll be all done. And I know folks from our team will be around, and maybe some of the panelists will as well. So if you have questions after this, just let us know. So I'm going to start by asking the panelists just to briefly introduce themselves, and I mean this sincerely. Each of them has a lot of great experience, and I just thank them again for taking time out of their busy schedules to be here today.
I guess I'm first. Thank you, Mark. My name is Matt Doskotch. I am Vice President of North American Legal and Intellectual Property for LivaNova. We have products that are both in the cardiopulmonary space and the neuromodulation space. I think I've been practicing over 20 years, some 22 years, I guess, and 15 years total in medical device. I was previously with Zimmer Biomet and Orthopedics.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandra Cito. I am the former Chief Compliance Officer at Cardiovascular Systems, Inc., and I say former because CSI was just recently bought by Abbott. So I'm in the process of transitioning out of my role there. I also just want to say that my comments today have nothing to do with the CSI acquisition by Abbott. They'll be general comments. I won't tell you how many years I've been in practice. It's longer than Matt. But I've been with CSI for almost 7 years, 10 years at Medtronic before that, partner at Dorsey before that. So I like to say I'm a little long in the tooth and have seen just about everything. So.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gordon Weber. I'm General Counsel at Surmodics. Surmodics is a publicly held company, about $100 million in sales. Historically, we've been focused on coatings technologies that improve the performance of other companies' medical device products. So things like hydrophilic coating, hemocompatibility coating, drug-eluting technologies, those kinds of things. But recently, we've developed our own portfolio of medical device products, primarily in the thrombectomy area, and we're working on commercializing those. Prior to joining Surmodics, I was general counsel for 4 years at Vascular Solutions. That included the period during which the company and its chief executive officer were indicted for felony off-label promotion charges. We successfully defended those charges in federal court in San Antonio, Texas. And then about a year after that, the company was acquired by Teleflex. Prior to all of that, I was with Faegre Drinker, Faegre and Benson at the time. I was a partner in the corporate group during doing M&A transactions, securities offerings, and advising companies on public company reporting and governance activities. So,
Thank you, everyone. So I have a list of questions here in case you're wondering what we're all looking at. We prepared some questions. And if we do have time, we'll entertain some questions from the audience. Obviously, not specific to any one of the panelists, backgrounds or business. But I'll just start with the first question, and it's a two-part question. I'm going to ask Sandra if she can take the first shot at this one. So if you, and all the questions really relate obviously to all the material we covered today. So if you are looking at another company to purchase, how do you handle due diligence from a compliance, so specifically compliance perspective, and what do you focus on?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First off, as much as we like to think that legal and compliance are the most important thing in the world, you have to realize that it's probably the tail wagging the dog in terms of due diligence. So you're going to have a limited time to do due diligence. You're not going to be able to do everything you want to do. You're not going to be able to ask all the questions you want to ask because, the marketing folks and the sales folks are going to take up all the oxygen in the room. So other thing to remember is that if you're looking to buy somebody, they're going to be subsumed within your compliance program as it is at some point in time. So really then what you need to focus on from a due diligence perspective is what are the specific risk areas of that particular company. Paul mentioned it when he was talking about the privacy aspects. Very much so, it's a sort of the same framework. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't ask general questions because you want to understand whether or not the target took compliance seriously. Did they have a compliance officer? Did they have a compliance committee? You kind of go through the 7 or 8 questions as Amanda talked about, or 7, 8 areas that Amanda talked about to really understand whether or not there's been a focus or even a recognition that compliance is important to the company. So you have to do those. But then really what you need to focus on and spend most of your time on is what are those particular risks of that particular company? Do they have a large sales force? If they do, then you're going to have to spend more time on what are the salespeople doing? Do they have a reimbursement hotline? Then you're going to have to look at that. Do they do direct to consumer? You're going to have different issues if they do direct to consumer. So it's really going to come down to really understanding the company, the target company's business. It's perfectly fine to ask questions about what do they consider to be their biggest risk areas, from a compliance standpoint. But you really need to look at where do they focus their energies from a business perspective and really look at those areas very, very closely. That's just a general overview of how I would approach it.
Thank you. Anything to add?
It's a pretty comprehensive answer. Yeah, I think you just really need to target your diligence efforts to the company and where it is and its development path, whether it's commercialized products or not, and how the products are being used as far as what kind of exposure there might be.
Yeah, I would say spending enough time in the non-compliance legal folders as well, like to get that understanding up front. Like I'll spend more time up front there, which will allow me to spend less time, quite frankly, in the legal and the compliance folders.
I think the other thing you also got to remember is that the Department of Justice understands that if you're an acquirer, you're not going to necessarily know every last detail about the company that you acquire. What they're looking for is if you do acquire a problem, that you take care of it right away and remediate it completely. Now, it doesn't mean you might not end up with some kind of fine or something like that. But the idea is through due diligence, you really want to find those big rocks. You want to find those big issues so that you can adjust your merger agreement to address them. But if you find something later on, then what you really need to do, well, and also if you find something during due diligence, you really need to make sure that you've got an integration plan that includes how you're going to remediate the issue. But that's the most important thing. It's, in my experience, there's very few compliance issues that become deal killers. Now, it might be that they just got a CID and, there's the start of a DOJ investigation. That clearly would probably be a deal killer. But besides that, there's very few things that you're going to find. And what you need to be able to do is be prepared to deal with them and take care of them after the fact. And frankly, do self-disclosure with the DOJ if you need to.
Great, thank you. So second part to that question, on the flip side, what do you do or what do you focus on if you are the target of the acquisition?
I liked Amanda's comment about not telling them what they ask you directly to tell them, but not giving them everything, because you can really get bogged down by providing them with too much information, too much detail. Frankly, the buyer will be overwhelmed because they don't understand the business generally. So keep it short, keep it brief, give them what they're asking for. And frankly, if you're the target, if there is something then and that you know about or something that's happened in the past, be very frank with them and say, this is what the problem was. This is how we remediated it. This is now our status. And that goes a long way as well, because again, when you're buying a company, you just don't want surprises. You don't want to find out after the fact that there's this big issue that you knew nothing about. So be forthright.
I think the other thing I was thinking of is be cautious on the attorney-client privilege piece, because as the acquirer too, I don't want you to tell me that
Yeah.
because you're going to kill
Yeah.
the privilege,
Yeah.
which then isn't going to transfer in the transaction later,
Yeah.
which is a huge problem. So.
Yeah, I agree with the points about, narrowly answering the specific questions that are asked. But to the extent that you do have your documentation in good shape and you should know ahead of time whether you're going to face a transaction fairly soon. It's a good time to beef up that documentation and maybe overwhelm the buyer with the quality of your compliance system so that they don't have as many they don't want to drill in as much with specific questions, and they don't feel like they need to have the narrative description of what you're doing because you've got all this documentation that you can throw at them and they can send their associates off to work on it and check a bunch of boxes.
I just want to add one thing. In my experience, in my many years of practice, it's always been beneficial to really set the stage when you start having due diligence discussions. So if you're going to be part of a due diligence call where they're talking about compliance, say, I want to take the first 5 minutes and tell you about our compliance program, tell you about our risk profile, give you an overview of areas that you won't even need to think about because it's really not a risk for us. And that really helps a lot in narrowing down then the subsequent questions, the data requests, things like that. Because then they're like, oh, you don't have big operations in Europe. We don't have to worry about Europe, right? Or whatever the issue is. You don't have a reimbursement hotline. We don't have to worry about that. So it really helps a lot to set that stage and really give them as much framework to know what the business is. It also really then proves to them that you know what you're doing, right? That you have your thumb on the pulse of the organization so that they're not thinking, yeah, I'm not sure about this compliance officer. Or I'm not sure about this legal department. They don't really seem to know what's going on in the company. So that's another point I would recommend.
Great responses. I've talked to clients at times where they're about to go into diligence. Maybe they're a smaller company, so they haven't gone through that process. And I explain how it's a courtship, and you want them to have confidence in you. So I think that's a really great point, Sandra. Another thing, one of our teammates at Gardner Law is Tim Phillips, who's at the FDA for 32 years, and he talks about this acronym TLAST, which he learned from some attorney when he was at the FDA and preparing for litigation. And I think it applies to diligence. TLAST is an acronym, TLAST, and it stands for tell the truth, listen to the question, answer the question, stop talking, tell the truth. So I would, that we share that with our clients for like FDA investigations or OIG or whatever it may be. And I think it would apply here as well. So for what it's worth, I'll leave you with that. I'm going to move to the next question. And Gordon, I'm picking on you here. As you all know, approved products are often used off-label. So that was something I chatted about earlier. Off-label is this sometimes a bad word people think, but I often share with clients, it's actually lawful for the physicians to use approved products off-label if they want to. We just can't promote them for those uses. And we can even respond to questions if we follow certain safe harbors. So knowing that a lot of products that are approved are used off-label, and what that means is a fashion that's not consistent with the approved FDA labeling. So how do you figure out, knowing that, how do you figure out if a product is being purchased in an acquisition is subject to off-label use? So
I think it's a great starting point that it's not illegal to use a product off-label. The FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine. They regulate what we can do in promoting our products to doctors. So I think I would start with our own marketing people and see what they know about how the product's being marketed and used, most importantly used, and what kind of market need they're looking to fulfill by adding the product to the portfolio. And then with that understanding, I would go to my internal regulatory people as well to understand the labeling for the product, the approved indication for use, and make sure that they have a good understanding of how the product's being used in the field and whether that would require a specific indication for use. Nate talked about specific versus general indications for use. That is an important point, that if there's a specific disease state that's being addressed or a specific part of the anatomy, it may require a specific indication, and that should give you some sense for whether the use is within the approved indication or not. And then only with that as background would I go to the target company sales folks to talk with them about their understanding of how the product's being used. And kind of maybe as a last step, I would want to make sure that legal and regulatory are focused on the regulatory history, the clearance, the approval of the product, as far as what kind of indications were initially requested versus what they ended up with. A lot of times you might ask for what you want as the indication, but the FDA can come back and tell you that it's going to be more burdensome to get that indication than you had hoped. So especially smaller companies, they'll take the lower resistance path to an approval that might not have the indication that they want, and then that creates the opportunity for a lot of off-label use or use that the FDA thinks should have a specific indication.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add a couple of other things that potentially you would want to look at? One is having your marketing folks do a literature review to find out what docs are publishing about the product, because a lot of times that'll include a lot of off-label use before there's actual an indication. And then the other thing is potentially looking at your grants and what have you done from either an investigative research study perspective, giving grant money to have a physician do a study, or other grants that you've done, because that's also another way. It might not even be what you've approved, but maybe what you've received, because that's another way. If there's a lot of interest in a particular off-label use of a product, you'll see it through literature, you'll see it through grant requests, things like that.
And I had a couple things to add. One was if you have an internal advisory board, like of HCPs, that might be a resource you can use. If you don't have one and an acquisition comes up, that would be a reason you would adjust your ANA, as was mentioned earlier. The other thing I actually have seen is an allowance to actually talk to certain HCP customers, to go and interview customers so the acquirer is asking the company they're acquiring or want to acquire, and ask the customers to interview and get a good sampling of that to see what their utilization is.
That also is something that's typically done mostly on the commercial side, because they really want to know what the adoption is going to be in the marketplace. So they might already be doing that. So if you can sneak in a few compliance questions in there, it'd be really helpful.
Yeah, and a lot of times that's done by a third party. So investment bankers or somebody like that will do it, because you don't want the public to know who's looking at the company. So they'll just, say that they represent a client while they're doing that kind of diligence.
Great points. Okay, so this was the second part of that question. And again, Gordon, if you could lead us off. What can you do to curb off-label promotion of newly acquired products?
Yeah, so that's the real rub, because as you said, it's not illegal for the products to be used off-label. It's illegal for them to be promoted off-label. And I think where I'd start there is with the promotional literature, having that reviewed in detail by your regulatory department to make sure that the way that the product's being promoted does comply with its approved or cleared indication for use. And you'd also want to talk to the target company's sales force about how they're selling the product and how they're training their employees on how to sell the product. If there is extensive off-label use for the product, they should be training on how to respond to customer inquiries about off-label use or requests for training on off-label use, because they're certainly going to get it. And if they don't have training for the sales folks on how to respond to that, they're just going to get themselves in trouble. And then you'd also want to look at the training material to make sure that it's consistent with everything that the sales folks have been telling you.
I actually know of a circumstance where there was an off-label use of a product, about 66% of the products being sold. And the FDA specifically came to the facility and asked for 10 years of literature associated with that particular product, which was fascinating. It turned out just fine, I heard. So, but that's something that can happen.
The other, another situation that I saw quite a few years ago was a product that was approved for a surgical use, but was being used in an endo use. So internal versus cutting versus going in internal through the femoral. And in that circumstance, the company decided to go to the FDA and ask them, they were going to tell them, we've got this issue, we're going to do a clinical study, and here's what we're going to do. Help us plan the clinical study, here's our execution plan for it. And that was the way that the company dealt with it. But that was, I think, a pretty unusual circumstance, and something that was clearly missed in due diligence.
Interesting. This next question is kind of along the same vein, and we may have covered it already, but I'll ask the panel if they have anything to add. So a lot of times, companies are bought before their products are approved. And so there's maybe not even a sales force yet in place. How would you approach labeling review? So this would be assuming that the product has been approved, to make sure the indication for use aligns with the commercial objectives.
Yeah, I think that's largely an internal discussion that you'd want to talk to your marketing people to make sure you know exactly how they want to be able to market it, again, what market need they're trying to fulfill with the product, and then make sure that they're talking with the regulatory folks so that there's that understanding between the two groups, so that marketing knows what regulatory can get and regulatory knows what marketing wants, and there's hopefully an overlap of that Venn diagram, and marketing understands what the costs might be to get more of what they want.
Sometimes you act as an intermediary in that discussion.
Your own side.
No, it's called breaking down silos.
Correct.
Like that. So I'm thinking of Amanda and Jesse and Nate, because a lot of these discussions, I mean, we're dealing with sort of the outcome, right? In this role of compliance, for example, or oversight as GC or whatever it may be. But these conversations really need to start very early on. Like we have this a product, device, drug, whatever it may be, and it works really great for X, or we think it's going to work really great for X. At that point, you should be thinking, right, Amanda, as this product, how is the FDA going to regulate it? Because I think someone mentioned earlier, I think maybe it was you, Gordon, that sometimes people will take this 510K path, for example, with a device, and it should really be a PMA. And so you're trying to market a device or a product for something that it's not approved for, which to Nate's point is, it's obviously very challenging. And I thought it was insightful where you talked about you've hired a bunch of salespeople to sell a product for an indication that they know how to sell it for, but it's ultimately not approved for that. So it's a very precarious situation to be in.
Well, it's an interesting thing because it's an economic choice associated with that, right? And so somebody made an economic choice, and yet they don't like to take, let's say, a 510K path, and yet they want to be able to make the PMA claims. Well, you made a choice, right? And so you have to live with that choice and convince them that you have to live with the choice.
Right. The other thing to remember is that people have short memories. So they might get caught up in deal momentum and be very excited about getting the product. And if it hasn't received clearance or approval yet, or even if there's some more development refining that needs to go on, there's some period of time that goes on between when you do the acquisition and when it starts to get commercialized. And during that period of time, frequently marketing people forget what the limitations that you talked about earlier, and they have focused the brass ring that they're trying to grab, and so you you might want to remind them. You want to be able to remind them of the discussions that you had previously and have some documentation of that. It's always helpful.
Great. Matt, I'll toss this next question to you. So what type of provisions can you include in your agreement, APA or SPA, to limit your exposure on not discovering a regulatory compliance or privacy diligence issue or limiting liability on a known diligence issue?
Almost all of this has already been talked about, so I'm just going to regurgitate a number of things. It could be provisions that require pre-closing activities to close out particular issues. Your representations and warranties may be an area where you can include provisions that handle that issue. That may depend, again, on who you're acquiring from and whether there's an entity that exists afterwards, because there may be nowhere to go afterwards, right? And so you'll have to live with whatever the consequence. And then there might be escrow. One thing that was mentioned was escrow, which may be a generalized pool of escrow funds that could cover any number of issues or a very specific set of escrow issues. A lot of times that happens in IP, where there's IP provision for, or provision in escrow for IP, very specific. And so you can include those. One thing I was thinking about too is milestones oftentimes come up relative to regulatory pathways. And that's always an interesting thing because it's tricky, because the acquiring company is the one responsible to then go get the milestones accomplished, right? And that may depend on how many people you acquire from the other company over, what sort of relationship they have with the prior company. There's a whole set of intricate kind of details you have to consider there. And my only caution there is be very specific about the language you choose in the milestones and be very clear. Like, it's better to be clear on both sides, because the way where you're gonna end up if you're not hitting milestones is probably somewhere in the middle of whatever the milestone amount was. So.
Yeah, you should also specify the level of effort that you have to put into achieving a milestone. That's one. I mean, even if you get the specificity right on the milestone, the seller's going to think you should move heaven and earth in order to achieve the milestone, and the buyer's going to think you should do it if it's convenient. So you gotta bridge that gap, and the more specific you can be, the less opportunity there is for disputes afterwards about it.
And then there are circumstances where that's not going to work, right? If you buy a public company, there's no way that you're going to have a holdback or any kind of anything whatsoever. So in those circumstances, it really then becomes a negotiation up front, whether or not it's a big enough issue to reduce the purchase price. That's the only option you have with a public company. So it's really going to be dependent on the type of company you're buying and the type of issue, but those are all great options.
I almost feel like we could use an M&A attorney at this program as well, but because that's very insightful, Sandra. Oh, question? Yeah. Okay.
Is there ever a responsibility for a drug or device company to intervene in a situation where off-label use is being heavily promoted by a layperson, such as a celebrity, viral TikTok video, etc.? Could that situation result in lawsuits or claims, or is there enough protection just by saying, hey, that's not what it's for, according to us and FDA?
I think that's a complicated question depending on whether or not you have an association with that person. If you're paying them to be a spokesperson, then they belong to you, and whatever they do is your responsibility. If you're not paying them, then it's a little bit more complicated. But in my estimation on this, it all comes down to whether or not you really think there's a patient safety issue. And you probably, if there's a patient safety issue, you probably have to move a little bit more heaven and earth to try and address it. Whereas if it's just something that's somebody's like, yeah, I get less wrinkles because I use this cream or something, it's probably not something you need to do unless they're your spokesperson. But it's really going to depend all entirely on the facts and circumstances associated with the issue.
The one area I can see is social media posting, where you're actually the first affirmative post and it's a responsive post, then you may have a duty to do something to mitigate that issue.
Yeah, I was going to mention there was a warning letter in a case where someone liked a post that was off-label, for example. So, Gordon, I think you had a comment?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, I think safety is the primary concern about whether you'd want to do something, and then just other general reputational risk. So it sounds like the question's kind of contemplating a crack job, that somebody's out there suggesting injecting, something to cure COVID or something crazy like that, you may want to disclaim that just to avoid reputational risk for the company.
Yeah, great feedback from the panel. One more question here. I know we're getting close to time, and Sandra, maybe I'll toss this one over to you to start with. Anything special to look for if a company operating under a CIA or that has completed a CIA?
Well, actually, I think it's, you know, you never really want to be a company that's under a CIA. Let's put it that way. But if you have to be in that circumstances, it's actually very helpful because there is one external affirmation that you're actually doing things right. Because under a CIA, you have to put in an annual report to the OIG, Office of Inspector General, and then they will tell you whether or not they've accepted your report for the year or not. If they do that, then you can point to that and say, look at that, you know, the OIG thought we were doing okay, you know, all that. The other thing about CIAs is that everybody knows with the CIA that you have to do certain basic things. You have to have a hotline, you have to have a compliance officer, you have to have a compliance committee, you have to have written policies and procedures. So that checks a lot of the boxes that I talked about earlier, those kind of 8 areas that you'd want to look at anyway. So to a certain extent, although CIAs aren't great, they're actually very helpful if you're doing due diligence on a compliance program. Now, obviously the risk of buying a company or being a company with the CIA is that if something goes wrong, even if it's not associated with the initial area that the CIA covered or what caused the CIA, then you're under a bigger scrutiny, under a bigger microscope. The government's going to come down harder on you if they see you as a recidivist. So that's the problem with, you know, buying a company that has a CIA in place or that's had one, and that if you have anything going forward, you know, it's going to be count strike 2. You know, somebody once said to me, having a CIA or finishing a CIA, you're really inviting the government into your house, and they're able to look at everything and not just the focus area of the CIA itself. So it cuts both ways. You know you're going to have a better compliance program generally if you have a CIA, but you're also going to be under a bigger microscope because you don't want to be a recidivist.
And I think there is some variability in CIAs. Some of them are, so you want to make sure you read and understand it very well. Some of them, you do kind of agree up front that practically if the government just makes an accusation, you'll accept it as, you know, they don't have to prove, or they don't have to prove to the same standard that they otherwise would, that you've got a compliance problem. There may be automatic penalties that are imposed, and then the government loves to find an opportunity to, most CIAs are for 5 years, they love to find something wrong during that 5-year period and then tack on additional time when they said that the non-compliance was occurring. So they can be helpful, like Sandra said, they cut both ways. They can be helpful in that you're going to have a better base compliance program, but it's also could be easier for the government to take additional action against you in the future.
All right, well, that concludes our program. I wanted to thank our panelists again and thank everyone for attending today. So we'll start our reception now. Thank you.